is Tuesday, April 7th, 2015, and we are here today with the privilege of talking to Milia Islam Majid about her life and her experiences as an interfaith peace builder. And my name is Amy Albrecht.
My name is Hee-Seung Lee. My name is Hyun Hwang.
So Milia comes to us from California.
Yes.
But she's no stranger to Boston. She attended Harvard Divinity School for her master's theological studies, focusing in world religions. And that was entered Harvard in 2001. And before that, lived in Missouri with her family, and before that, lived in Bangladesh. Currently, Milia is the director of the South Coast Interfaith Council in Southern California, which is a role that she has held since 2008. And prior to that, she has had experiences both with the Islamic Society of North America and the Islamic Society of Boston. So Milia, thank you
You're
for being
welcome.
here with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate that.
So to get us started, I wonder if you could tell us what some of the major experiences, significant moments in your life have been.
Sure. So as Amy had kind of spoken about, I came here. I wasn't born in the United States. I came here when I was at the age of 6, and so I would say probably one of the most significant experiences was just coming to America itself and what that entailed. And most particularly where we kind of landed in America. I grew up in a very homogenous community in the Midwest. Midwest is kind of considered the Bible Belt of America. And I always say where I grew up is like the sparkling, like shiny buckle of like the Bible Belt of America. So I grew up in Fulton, Missouri, and at that time growing up, it was a predominantly Caucasian, all Christian community of about, at that time probably a little over 10,000 or so. So then suddenly here's like this brown family that comes in, and people are just perplexed and confused. And so that experience itself was a very defining experience just in my life in general. Being perceived as something that's so different, and people just quite couldn't figure it out and what that meant. And I think that really kind of built the foundation for the work that I do now, some 20, 30 years later. So that's probably one of the most significant experiences in my life. And then if we kind of move forward from that point, in terms of my religious identity, specifically, I would say my grandmother's passing away was a huge, huge significant experience. She actually lived with my uncle, who sponsored, for those of you who migrated to America, you have to have the visa sponsorship and all of that. So this was my mother's oldest brother, and he sponsored us. He was doing his residency in ophthalmology in a rural town of Mexico, Missouri. Missouri had Mexico, Lebanon, Paris. The whole world was there. So of course that's why we went there. But he was in Mexico, Missouri, and my grandmother actually lived with him. So that was his mother. And probably for the last 6 years of her life, my grandmother is like my heart and soul. So this was quite some time ago, but she was completely bed rest. And so on the weekends, my mother and I would always go there, and we would spend the weekend there, and we would just take care of her. That she couldn't do anything. But she was amazing, never complained, never, nothing like that. She was just a phenomenal woman. But she passed away, and I was 19 at that time. It was really hard for me, I just couldn't understand why this happened and all that drama. But it was also in the Islamic tradition, as many of you or some of you may know, one of the rites of death or passages of death is you wash the body, right? So you wash the body and you clothe the body and whatnot. And so I remember I'd asked my mother, can I do this? Would that be okay? And her response was, you've done this before in terms of when she was alive, and if you're okay with it, I'm totally fine with it. And it was really one of the most defining experiences of my life in terms of my religious identity. Because I think at that time when I saw my grandma, and I remember watching her and, you know, braiding her hair, and I remember giving her a kiss on her forehead. And it just, you know, it just put everything in perspective for me. I don't think I've ever been so, I don't think my focus was ever as clear as on that day. And in terms of its relation to my academics, I was actually going on to medical school. This was my junior year. So, you know, did all the things that I was ready to do for medical school, but I dropped out from sciences and I did psychology and religion. And so that again really started my academic trajectory to what I do now. And also it was the day of my grandmother's funeral that I started wearing the hijab, and that also brought in its own set of unique circumstances in Fulton, Missouri. And then I think one other one would be, I'm very close to my parents, and you'll kind of get this as we do this, but when I think I was 9 years old, we were at the grocery store, and kids, I mean, we remember things, you know, I think oftentimes we sell kids short, but my mother had on kind of like the traditional, you know, attire of like the salar kameez and whatnot, and she was at a grocery store. Now my mother was in medical school before she came here, so she was highly educated. My father was a colonel in the army. So in a third world country, you're either very well-to-do or you're in poverty, and we were well-to-do insofar as our education and all that stuff. But come to America, that means absolutely nothing. So basically my parents started from scratch again. And so my mother worked at a shoe factory up until throughout my high school years. And my father, while he was starting his business as an optician, he used to work the graveyard shift at McDonald's. And they didn't know how to speak English very well. And so my mother was trying to get some vegetables from the grocery store, like, you know, and there was another man, and he was basically telling her to move. But my mother couldn't quite comprehend exactly what he was saying because, you know, she's just, I mean, they came in their 40s, and she was dressed in a certain attire. And I remember that man, I don't remember precisely what he said, but I remember my mom crying. I remember that my mom cried in that grocery store, and it was because of what he said. And that day, I precisely remember I told myself that, you know, one day, I'm gonna grow up and I'm gonna be super smart and I'm gonna dress really weird and I'm gonna like do all kinds of things and I'm gonna make people realize that just because a person looks a certain way doesn't mean that they aren't intelligent or that there isn't worth that's attributed to that individual. So that really, so then when I came to Harvard, I taught for the last 3 years. I was a teaching fellow, and I would wear like kameezes and like South Asian attire, and I mean, I wore all kinds of stuff, and you know, the students in the beginning would be like, oh, she must have an accent, or you know, something like that. And I would like completely defy their stereotypes, and I loved it. And it was all rooted in that interaction in that grocery store, you know, stemmed from there. So I think like, you know, those are some of kind of the defining moments in my life that really shaped who I am, I think, today.
Would you be able to say more about wearing the head covering? Because you noted how significant that was, it came from a very significant moment and has surely colored your experiences since.
Yeah, I mean, I always kind of, growing up Muslim in America, anywhere, but certainly most specifically in the Midwest and being such a minority, you know, you kind of, it's an everyday negotiation of your faith and what you practice, what you don't, especially in your adolescence and when you're younger, because you want to fit in. I mean, that's, you know, that's just the trajectory of adolescence is such that. But I always wanted to do this, and but I never really quite had the courage, because no matter how confident you are to purposely stick out in such a way, it's not easy. But the day after my, you know, again, death has a way of making you kind of question things and things like that, and so, okay, I'm just gonna do it, you know. And so I remember I put on the scarf and I went to my father. I'm very close to my father, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do it, and he was just quiet. He was just quiet, and he just looked at me, and in the thing that he said, he's like, you know, I will always support what you do, but recognize that you are embarking on a path that might be quite challenging for you. You know, just know that before you step outside of the door. And it was very challenging. But you know, it was fascinating. I was at Westminster, I went to a private liberal arts Presbyterian college. It was my junior year. I'm a pretty likable person, I smile a lot, you know, things like that. And so everybody knew me, but it was amazing. Like that first 6 months of wearing a hijab, like people were so scared of me. You know, people who knew me, like we were just talking about this last night, little incidents like I would be on campus and I would be walking on one side of the road, like sidewalk, and students would literally move over to the other, you know, because they were just so freaked out. And then I remember I used to work at the library, and it was a small library, and I used to check out the books, you know, worked at the desk. And literally there would be like a herd of students in the corner just like going like this because they needed their books to be checked out, but they were afraid to come to me. And I was like, you know, I was like, dude, like the only way you're gonna get your books checked out is if you come to me. It's just, there's like no other option available here, you know. That's it. Like I go when 11 o'clock, I go home, you need your books. But you know, they were just kind of, like they were so scared. So I think it really made me realize like how an external image, and I think of something that is often very misunderstood, how it can really just bring out a sense of fear in the other. But at the same time, fast forward, you know, 6 months or whatnot, everybody was so comfortable with it. So I think it really made me kind of realize the importance of personal relationships and really taking, also making me, I think for the first time I truly understood what it meant to be the other, because people, and what that really means and how you feel. And so again, but I think it played in the motivation to do the work that I do, because I've been there, you know, to know how it feels to be misunderstood or thought of as something that you're not, you know, and given an identity that you yourself don't own, but that it's imposed on you. And I think that's really helped influence the work that I do, which is, you know, bridge building and making sure that others don't ever feel the way that I felt, you know, when people were attributing these negative identities to me or perceiving me as something that I totally was not. So it was when I started my program at Harvard, it was on September 11th, the day of September 11th. I had my hijab on, same thing, and my parents were in the airport, in fact, on the next flight out, and I didn't know that. And so I remember Dean Belva Jordan came into our orientation, and she brought in the TV, and, you know, we saw the planes go in and all that stuff. And you know, for me, it was just like, in my mind, the only thing I could think is that, you know, are my parents on that plane? Because I didn't know, you know, I just knew they were flying back that day. And for those of you who were in Boston around that time, you know, everything was shut down. So it wasn't until that evening that I got a phone call and, you know, saying that they were okay. The FBI had picked them up from the airport and questioned them and all that. But I had my hijab on at that time as well. And my last name was Islam, and I remember just horrible emails were sent to me, and I don't know, you know, they just figured it out. My last name is Islam, and I was a new student there, no one knew me. But one specific email I remember, and I had to go to the dean, and then I went to they made me go and have a police report. It was like Twilight Zone, and you know, and it said, you know, not only do I wish for you to die in a painful death, but I wish that upon your children. And that just shook me to the core, you know, because there was so much, again, fear and anger. You know, and it was automatically attributed to me because of how I looked. So it was almost like reliving what I lived through in Fulton in those onset years. So it's definitely, I've learned a lot from this little piece of cloth, this little piece of cloth that I wear around my head. So, but again, I think one of the most things in relation to my work as like a peace builder, I think it's definitely made me understand how it feels to be misunderstood. And you don't have to be Muslim to be misunderstood. You know, any faith, any culture, any race, I think just any extent, at one point in their life, people feel misunderstood. And I think until you have been there, it's very hard to realize how dehumanizing that can be, and like what role you can play to make sure that that doesn't take place.
Thank you for sharing those memories, and a very important part of your life and your journey. You mentioned already your grandparent or your grandmother, your uncle, your parents particularly. Would you be able to perhaps elaborate on your relationships with them, or if there are other significant relationships and people in your life you could share with us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's probably no one closer to my heart than my mother and father. I've always just been very close to them. And a lot of it, I think, is because I've always been fascinated by immigrant stories, because they were the immigrant story. You know, coming here, I was in Bangladesh, I was a spoiled brat. I was so spoiled, so it's probably a good thing I came here because I was just not a good person back then. But I remember I was 6 years old and I had my own driver and my own chauffeur and my own van. And my brother had his own car, and his own driver, and things like that. I mean, that's in a third world country. If you're in some sort of political power, my father, after he actually retired from the army as a colonel, and then he worked with the president. So it was just like this huge gap of, well-to-do and poverty. But when we came here, none of that mattered, right? It was literally starting from the beginning. And so I think for me, as a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old, I really saw what that meant for an individual, particularly for an adult to go through that. Where at literally a year before you walk outside and there's random people saluting you because you're a colonel in that country. And I remember seeing my father. I remember seeing my father cleaning the bathroom at McDonald's, like things like that and what that meant. Or my mother, she would come home and, she would cry because people were mean to her at the shoe factory because she didn't know how to speak English, but they persevered, like they did it. And they did it because of their children, they wanted to give us a better sense of education and a more. In third world, I can only speak of Bangladesh experience, but there's a lot of corruption as well. So you can do well, but you're in a corrupted system. So in anthropology, what did they say? You be cognizant of your environment because you become what's in your environment. And that was one of the core reasons why they moved to America, migrated to America. So I think seeing them struggle, but keeping their faith while they struggle, that I think was very, very formative for me. So I think I would say anything that's really good in me, came from God and my parents. It's really a ramification of what they did and who they are. But they just, they made it, praise God, they made it and they raised 2 children and to me that's just, I'm amazed how that could have been done, especially in Fulton. Who goes to Fulton, Missouri, honestly, but.
Do you know how they ended up there?
I do. I always say God has a sense of humor, from Bangladesh to Fulton. Well, because we were with my uncle in Mexico, Missouri, and then my uncle is an ophthalmologist, and he wanted to open a practice in Fulton, Missouri. And so my father had to figure out the most important thing at that time was economic stability. Because even though the conversion of money, things like that, literally it's nothing when you come to America. So the first and foremost priority was how am I going to have some sort of economic stability so I can raise these children. So aside from working odd jobs, which he's done all his life, my uncle wanted to open a practice in Fulton. And so my father studied to be an optician, which is basically selling the frames and working with the frames and things like that. So then my uncle was like, why don't you do this as well? And there was a university there, Westminster College. So my parents looked into that college and they said, and that's what fascinates me. I was 6 years old at that time, right? So for them to have that foresight and be like, there's a good college there, we can raise our kids there, they can go to their undergraduates there, and then they can move on to where they want to for their graduate school. So then that was really the intent, and so then we moved to Fulton and started our journey in Fulton. So my parents for sure, probably the top 2 people in my life that have influenced me and I think just made me who I am. Moving forward, I didn't have a Muslim community growing up because there were no Muslims, so you can't have a community if they don't exist. So I relate to you when you were talking earlier about not having a sense of community. But I think again, God protect them. I think my parents, I don't know, they weren't threatened by other faiths though. So growing up, I went to church, and I was always fascinated by faith. I don't know why. Maybe because it was so important to my parents. I didn't appreciate this growing up, but as Muslims, you pray 5 times a day. One of the things my father was adamant about, regardless of when we were in high school, I was president of the school, my brother was president of tennis or captain or whatever it is, all that stuff. So we would have commitments outside of the home at night. Regardless of how late you came home, you always prayed the last prayer of the evening together. You could go to bed, if it was, my brother had a tournament, he's not gonna come home until 2, you can go to bed. But when my brother comes home, we're all gonna wake up and pray together, and it was so annoying. You know, it was like, is this really necessary? You know, let's talk about this. But it was, and again, you know, looking back, I see the importance of it. So you know, things like that. You know, it was so. Faith was very in the house for me because there was nothing outside of the house. So prayer was very important for me. Having God consciousness was very important for me. It was very important for them, and in turn for me. But when I came to Harvard, oh my God, there were like Muslims everywhere, and I was like, oh my God, this is like crazy, you know. So I would say, like for me, you know, particularly, I didn't always venture out to a lot of like other areas, but in that Cambridge area, and particularly on the campus of Harvard, the Muslim community there, the student community, they also had a huge impact on me and my identity formation as well. Because for the first time in my life, I met people that are my age who like also chose to wear a scarf, and I was fascinated by why they wanted to do it, and it wasn't limiting to them. I mean, these were like such intellectual, like well-rounded students who were doing like phenomenal things, you know, but not in spite of their faith, but motivated because of their faith. And to me, that was huge, you know, because I was like, wow, that's so cool. Like, if you can do that, I can do it too, you know, like things like that. So, I mean, definitely, like on an individual level, my parents, and as a collective level, as a community, I would say just that Muslim student community really had a formative, they were very formative for me in my religious identity.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I deeply touched by your life story. So I would like to ask you something others. And how would you describe your work of peace building? And also if you there are some changes in your peace building.
Mm-hmm.
So could you explain more about your trajectory of your peace building?
Sure.
Yeah.
You know, I never knew I was a peace builder until until I started working in the work I do, and then again, people kind of attribute that character to you, and they're like, oh, okay, I guess I am. So up until my career point, you know, it was just like it was just living, you know, like you. And I think a lot of it, I think I had a peculiar situation again, being such a minority in a predominantly dominant culture and society that was so different from what I am in terms of religious practice and things like that. You just learn to get along with people because either you choose to live very insular, which is something we never did, or you learn ways to build bridges. You know, you learned. I went to Bible school. You know, I learned about the faith, but. And it didn't feel in any way it was compromising who I am as a Muslim, you know, but that I was just engaging in really learning about the other. And as I started my work, especially with the Interfaith Council, I think I became also aware of a lot of the challenges that come with it, because suddenly, you know, it's not about you. It's not about just building myself as a human being in terms of what I'm studying and things like that. But you're trying to build bridges across communities, you know, across communities that oftentimes simply don't even talk with one another, right? And what does that mean? So it went from a very personal thing to a very community thing. And along with that came a lot of challenges, because you have your own story, and certainly that can be influential, but to move a whole community to engage in just simply getting to know one another, because you have to understand that community also carries a lot of history with it, right? History of one another, and you have to work with that. So I think if there's one thing that probably I've noticed in my trajectory in my career is that sometimes peace building has a very like fluffy kumbaya notion to it, but there's in fact a lot of challenges embedded in as well. And how do you navigate those challenges? How do you engage those challenges effectively? You know, how do you engage with communities and peace building in an authentic way? You know, where it's not about just the surface of let's hold hands and everything will be okay, but that, you know what, you have a history that's, you have a perception of my community that's very negative, rooted in a lot of things. And I have a perception of your community that's very negative. We can't negate that, but let's work with that and see what kind of relationship we can still build. So I think one of the things I've noticed is that it's not always easy, you know, when you're really truly trying to build those bridges. But at the same time, I've always been a optimist in nature. It is possible, but it takes time. It also takes time. And in my experience, my organization is a very grassroots organization. You know, we serve 35 cities, 170 different faith communities affiliated, 1,700 individuals, all our programs are grassroots. So one of the things I've learned is that, for me, I truly believe it starts at a grassroots level, you know, where you relationship building, things like that. It's so, so important. So I would say that, you know, in terms of how my view has changed, I think it went from a very like, sure, we can all get along, why not, you know. There's core principles in our theologies that unite us, you know, da-da-da-da. But in practicality, there's a lot of divisions that exist. And you can't just brush that under the rug, but you really have to deal with it. And how you deal with it in each community is very different as well. And to honor that, you know, not to just kind of push that aside, but really to engage with that is really important, I think. So I think just truly being authentic to the process of peace building and acknowledging that it's not always a pretty journey, but if you stick at it, it can be a very powerful journey though.
So you already mentioned that bridging community is not easy, and then the engagement is not easy. And so if you do the peace work, and do you have a specific purpose, and do you have a more higher goal of your work?
I mean, in terms of just my organizational goals of them, I mean, again, on an organizational perspective and the role I play, you know, we pride ourselves in creating communities of compassion, right, among people of different faiths and cultures, through service, through education, and through celebration, right? So in terms of just the method in which we choose to kind of approach this phenomenon of peace building is really engaging with one another, but in a structured way. Because oftentimes you can have a conversation, but not really have a conversation. You know, you're just smiling at each other, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm all about smiles. But, you know, how do you continue that? How do you continue that relationship? And what I've found is that you also have to have a plan. You know, it can't be just about, you know, I'm going to meet with you, and that's going to be great. We're going to have tea together, and that's fantastic. And then I don't see you for 3 years. You know, and in that 3 years, you're still formulating all these perceptions and understandings of me that aren't necessarily true. You know, and me as well. So I think one of the things, you know, I myself am a very kind of an organized freak, like fun freak type person, but I've learned that you really need to have a plan as well and see what works, and then continue to be persistent in that, you know, and not get frustrated easily. It's not always easy.
Yeah, in turn, how your personality or how your life experience shaped your peace building work? It affects, yeah.
Growing up in Fulton, Missouri, I mean, that place just completely formulated me. I think there's a certain, it wasn't easy. I smile a lot and I joke about it a lot, but it was tough. But at the same time, I think, you know, there are charms to being in a small community. In terms of just, like I said, you realize that you have to engage with the other person, and in doing so, you build these relationships. And I think that, and I think my faith. I think, you know, when you look at, and I would argue this is existent in all faith traditions, but these moral precepts that exist in our faith traditions, right? You know, to be the kind of person, the moral mandates, you know, to be kind, to be things like that. Oftentimes we take that for granted, actually. You know, if you truly implement that, you'll see it's phenomenal in terms of the results that you achieve with that. So I think, you know, in terms of unique things to me, I think growing up in Fulton has shaped me a lot. You know, when I came to Boston, I remember I used to like just go around and say hello, 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 and nobody responded back. And I was like, what's up with that? Like, no one said hi to me, you know. Like my roommate pretty much is like, honey, no, don't do that. You know, like, what's wrong with that? I mean, some people still attribute to it. I'm like, hi, you know, that's what we did, you know. But I think, again, being authentic to yourself, that's who I am, you know. I get it. You have to decide for, you know, you have to decide for what situation that you're in, but don't lose who you are. And I think that's one of the things that's really important, because I truly believe people can sense sincerity. And I think if you're authentic to yourself, if you're sincere, you know, things will get done. You know, people will get to know who you really are. So I think just that small town mentality has helped me a lot. You know, sometimes it makes me look like a fool, but I'm okay with that, you know, because once you engage with me, hopefully you recognize I'm not a fool. You know, I might approach you differently. I might have a very positive disposition when I approach you, but it doesn't mean that I'm not cognizant of the challenges that may be involved in that relationship, but I choose to focus on the positive and build on that. So I think that's a big thing. And again, I think my faith, I look at the examples in the Islamic history of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and how he interacted with people, the kind of respect that he gave to people, the kind of honoring each other as human beings, right? First and foremost, regardless of what faith you are, what culture you are, what race you are, whatever, just honoring one another as human beings. I always say that, people just have these taglines, and I'm always known to say that, the moment that you can see the image of yourself in the heart of the other, that's when the meaningful relationship can start. And so to conduct yourself in order to see that when I'm talking with Amy, Amy is an extension of myself. So how am I going to treat myself, and I'm going to treat Amy that way? That's not to say that it's always, that I always receive that. In fact, a lot of times I don't. But, that's okay, because everybody's at different points in their lives. So I think just those characteristics, I think people just want to connect on a human level. They want to know you're human, just don't pretend to be something you're not. It's okay to be silly or smiley or, you know what I mean? I think oftentimes we get very boxed into this is how we should be. And in the process, we kind of lose who we are. And I think that's when I don't think change can happen that way. I think you have to be authentic to yourself, and have confidence in that. So, and I think for me, I find that in my faith. I find that where be true to yourself, know who you are, right, and don't be ashamed of that, and allow that to be the motivating factor to do what needs to be done, what you feel that you can contribute to in the world. And so you just do that, and not to take things too seriously. Live every day.
Yeah, I have one more question.
Yeah.
So when you look at your life, and then what is your most contribution to your peace-built world?
I hope that when I'm no longer here on this earth, and all of you pray for me when I'm no longer here on this earth. I hope that someone can say that, she was a peace builder who was motivated by her Islamic faith. I hope that people can say that. That's what I hope. I'm not I hope I'm not, and I don't think I am, because I know how it feels to have faith imposed on you. If I could have a penny for the amount of times, someone tried to convert me, especially in Fulton, Missouri. That was all I'm the amount of times I've been told I'm going to hell, all those things. I really try to live in a conscious way to where I never impose my faith on you, that, hey, but rather through example, right? So that people know that you're a Muslim, not because I'm saying, I believe this, and this is the Quran, and this is my prophet, and this is what happened in Islamic history, but just in conversation with me, I clearly look a certain way, and this can be challenging, but I think it can also be really great, right? Because I'm almost like a walking stereotype until you get to know me, and then you're like, oh, she's not like that at all. So I hope that the way that I'm contributing is that people are recognizing that I truly am trying to build bridges, that I truly am trying to create a world where we respect one another as human beings, and that the motivation for me to do that is so much rooted in my faith, and I'm proud of that.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Then I would like to ask about your crisis. What crisis or struggles have faced you in your work of peace building?
Mm-hmm. It was interesting. I had a lecture at UCLA that was focused precisely on that just a month ago. And what's really, really even more fascinating is that the one thing that is my motivation factor is also my greatest struggle, and that's me being Muslim, right, in the work that I do. Because, and again, this is, I can only speak from my experience, but there's so much misconception about this Muslim identity and what it entails, right? So when, so that in itself can become a challenge, right? The one thing that motivates me on a personal level, on a societal level, is also becomes the most challenging thing for me, because people already have preconceived notions about who I am, about what my faith does, what alternative motives must I have if I'm embarking in a meeting, things like that. For examples, I remember when I started my position, I was the first Muslim. My organization has been here for 62 years. And in that 62 years, I was the first Muslim as the executive director. And at that time, there was an email that was sent out. That was sent out in the faith community, and someone had just forwarded it to me. And they were literally a group of like 50 or some faith leaders were CC'd on this email. And it was by a very conservative Jewish rabbi, and just saying, oh, you know, now look, we have this woman who wears a scarf and her last name is Islam, and she's gonna come and turn this organization completely inside out, and she has an agenda. He had never met me, right? So, but that was the notion that he had, right? And so after consulting with my board about that, you know, one of the board members, I even asked her, I was like, you know, would it be okay if I extended an invitation to have coffee with him? Like, you know, would that be fine? And they're like, oh, sure. And I did that. And it's been 7 years, and to this day, he's never responded, right? And I've done it multiple times. But and I'm sure there's probably something in his history that makes him have such a strong stance against me. But I've never met him in person. Maybe he has met me in my number of events and things like that. But things like that, right? There's always this kind of, almost this negative attribute and notion and assumption and agenda that's like attributed to me that's not real, right? So you have to fight through that. You constantly have to kind of go through that. My father used to always tell me, you know, Milia, before you go, I do a lot. All I do is meet people, basically. I live in my car. And so from one place to the other, and on record, I have an amazing secretary. So, you know, Adrian, if you ever see this, you know, I love you. You're fantastic. That's why I'm able to do what I do. But, you know, my father would always say, before you physically meet with someone, Milia, like, have a phone conversation with them or like, you know, email them. And the wisdom behind that is that when you listen to me, I have no accent, right? You know, and I sound pretty American as it can be, you know, but I look very different. But having that phone conversation or that email, they see me for that. They see me for who I am and not what I look like. So then when I follow that up with a meeting, you know, they don't get freaked. They'll always have like a second, like, you know, oh, that's you, you know? But they already know me, right? You know, they know, oh, this is Milia, this is what she wants to do. And that comes from experience, because I've learned that otherwise people carry these, you know, negative assumptions and stereotypes and things like that, and that can really hurt in the process of trying to build bridges with one another. So I would say that's probably one of my greatest challenges, is my Muslim identity in terms of not personally for me, but on a societal level, how people perceive that to be. And then other challenges, you know, again, being a woman, you know, I think just being a woman in general is challenging at times. Certainly being a woman that wears a scarf is challenging at times as well. But yeah, and I also have to say, being in quote unquote the real world, you also realize that a lot of people simply also just don't know about their faith traditions, right? Mm-hmm. And that can be really challenging when you're trying to engage with communities of faith. If people don't really know, you know, there would be meetings I have with pastors, and I just wanted to be like, can I just tell you about your history? And then we can just talk about it, you know, because, you know, in conversation, you understand that, no, it wasn't like that, you know, but you can't say that in the first meeting, right? So you're like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, yeah, you know, and then you're like, okay, I really have to build this relationship to the point where I'm like, you know, about that, what you were saying, you know, like things like that. So that can be challenging as well, especially coming from, I think Boston is very peculiar, very unique in the sense that, I mean, it's so, I mean, look at all of you guys, you know, it's about academics, just fantastic, you know, about education, the power of education and things like that. But the rest of America isn't necessarily like that, right? You know, and a lot of it is at times because they don't have the luxury to be like that. You know, you have, you know, if you go to South Central LA, no one has the luxury to, you know, be educated. They're just trying to survive, you know. So working within that context to where you're building these bridges, you need to know each other's history, but you're clear that they don't know their history, let alone your history. So how are you, you know, what are you going to do? So really deciphering what to do for each community and having the time and making the investment of the time to do that.
Then I have one question. what is your joyful moment when you are taking your peace with the world?
Oh, I think it's the people I meet. I mean, and when you can see that you've done something to change a person's mind for the better, right? I mean, that to me is like totally worth everything. I always share this story. I do a lot of public speaking, and I go to a lot of faith communities and speak and whatnot. And I was invited by a quite orthodox synagogue in the South Bay to speak about Islam, you know, and my picture's on the flyer or whatever, and my name and da-da-da. And I go in there, and, you know, it's like an hour and a half talk, and there's question and answers and all this stuff. And at the end, this lovely little woman comes up to me, and she's like, "Oh, Melia, thank you so much." And I always remember what she said. She goes, "You know, I have to be honest. When I saw you and I saw that you were coming to talk about Islam, I was like, you know, what is she gonna tell me that I don't already know? You know, she hates us, we hate you guys. This is just how it, like, what is she gonna say? What is she gonna say?" And she goes, "But you know what? I have to be honest and say." She goes, "I just want to put you in my pocket right now and take you home." You know, to me, that was fantastic. I mean, I think that's what it's all about, right? Because I think I humanized it for her, right? I presented like a counter narrative in like a live form to what she thought I was or what Islam was. And that to me is like the greatest joy. Like, you know, this little, because then that's going to affect the way that she talks about me or Muslims to another person, and then that's going to affect it to another person and another person. It's all about grassroots for me. And it's not just about Muslims, it's about other faith traditions as well. If I can change the perception, a negative perception of one another to a positive one, like to me that's ultimate joy. Because then I think you're truly building peace one person at a time. You know?
Thank you.
Thank you
You're
for sharing
welcome.
all of those details and all the stories along the way. I'd like to open up the time for our classmates to ask questions that may have come up for them during the past hour.
I have one,
Sure.
and I'm totally not trying to trip you up. It might
Okay.
sound like I am. Going off of a couple of things you said, I think that life presents beautifully profound, paradoxical truths. So I'm interested in what you were talking about honoring difference, and how you work with instead of negating, and how that's also related to how you were talking about how the other becomes an extension of the self. So at the same time, there's a sense of we appreciate difference. There's another sense in which there's an extension of
Your own self.
a sort of sameness or so.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think when I say about an extension of ourselves, right? Do you guys know Rick Warren? You know Rick Warren, he's the mega, like, I mean, this man, how he raises money is phenomenal. I hope he does a fundraiser for me one day. But like, he's local to where we are. And I remember we were at a meeting once and he said this thing, he goes, you know, for me to love you, Amy, as a person, I don't have to love everything about you. Those earrings, I don't know. I mean, I like them, but you know what I'm saying? Like, that's, you know, you don't necessarily have to do that, right? So I think when I say an extension of ourselves, I mean in a very human level. That, you know what, you're a human being, you're a child of God. You know, I certainly didn't create you. The same God that created me created you, right? There are differences that we may have in our faith. I wear a scarf. You're sitting next to me, you don't. You can't say that we're not different, right? So not to negate that and say, oh, Amy, you and I are the same. No, we're not. You know, we're not. I'm motivated by my own faith precepts as you are yours, right? And there's differences in that. But for me, in my work that I do and in my life, I choose to look at the points of commonality that exist between our faith, right? So what are the points of commonality that exist between Catholicism? And what are the points of commonality that exist between Islam? And let's focus on that. It doesn't mean that I negate the fact that, you know, you are Catholic, you believe in the Holy Trinity. I am Muslim, I don't believe in that, right? But I can still respect you as a human being and honor you as a human being, because at the end of the day, when we cut ourselves, we're all gonna, you know, our blood is red, you know? So in that way, I honor each other as an extension of my own self. But in terms of, you know, but you can't negate the differences, and I don't think you should. I think the moment that you start to negate the differences, then that's like putting a Band-Aid on something. I think it's with the differences, right?
Mhm.
With the differences, still choosing that, you know what, that's your faith and this is my faith, but that doesn't mean that we can't have an intersection of our lives together, right? We still can. And how can we best do that to where we're serving the greater humanity? Let's focus on that and let's build on that. So I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Lisa Sampson. Thank you again for sharing your story. One question that I have is, I don't know if you could share a moment that comes to mind, an instance where you as a leader had to make a decision or were put in a situation where you either needed to take a risk or you were uncertain as to how you were going to proceed in a difficult situation as a leader, and maybe what things you called upon to help you make that decision.
Sure. I mean, there's multiple things. I mean, one of the situations for me that was very formative or that sticks out is when I first started working at the Interfaith Council. I just graduated. I did about 2 years of research with I did some work with the Muslim community with leadership training of imams through ISNA, and did some research work with Dr. Ingrid Mattson, and then I started this position. And so, I've always been, in some capacity or the other, very passionate about my own community as well, building it, growing it, all that stuff. And when I moved to California and I started this position, some of the leadership in that area invited me for a meeting, and I thought, oh, this is great. They're gonna say, hey, welcome Milia, we're so happy to have you here, blah, blah, whatever. But when I went there, and this is me being very honest, the whole premises of the meeting for them was that, oh, Milia, why are you wasting your talents outside of our community when you can be working within our community? And look, you work for this organization that advocates for everything, everything is great. We're always about honoring the individual. So regardless of faith, regardless of culture, sexual orientation, and not honoring that person as a human being. And their understanding was that, by doing that, aren't you compromising yourself as a Muslim, right? Aren't you compromising your faith? And that was really shocking for me. It was very hurtful for me as well, especially coming from, and the caveat to this is that, and I'm sure someone's probably touched upon this in the class, on an anthropological point of view, there's the immigrant generation, there's the indigenous generation, and each generation brings things from their past, to create the community and whatnot. And this was predominantly in immigrant leadership. And for me, it was really hurtful though, because here I am, and I'm really super excited. I'm the first Muslim that they've ever hired, and at that time they're 55 years, and I'm clearly Muslim. I mean, hello, look at me, And yet you're like, oh, isn't that going to compromise your faith though as a Muslim? Because this organization is so welcoming of everything and everyone. So that for me was really, internally, that was a crisis for me, because I was like, oh my God, am I? And oh God, and these are people I look up to a certain degree because it's the leadership, right? But then I really thought about that, and I remember I was just quiet at that time, and then I had sent them an email, and I was like, it's I have to say, I'm sure it came with good intent in terms of what you're trying to tell me, but I truly believe that, in fact, I will be serving the Muslim community the absolute best in the capacity that I will be working in the Interfaith Council, because they need to see that, Muslims aren't this, it's not a homogenous group, it's not a group that's just linear, but there's so much diversity, and that's important, and that there are Muslims who clearly have a very Islamic identity, who want to build these bridges, who want to honor everyone, and that's equally important. But I have to say, in the beginning, it kind of shook me up, because suddenly here's this kind of religious, leadership that's telling me, but, isn't that going to compromise? Aren't you compromising your faith when you're doing that? But I don't. I truly believe I don't. And I don't think. I think that's one of the fears that a lot of faith communities have in interfaith work, is somehow by engaging in another faith community, you are somehow compromising your own faith as a Catholic, as a Muslim, as whatever it is. So that for me was probably, and it was right in the onset, when I was starting my real world or whatever. So, but I don't think it is at all. I don't think I compromise it at all. My mom always, I talk to my parents every night, even to this day, and my mom and I like babble on about the day. I'm like, oh, and I did this, and I did that, and they're like, oh, okay, honey, time to go. And I remember at one point I had a lot of meetings at church, and then it was like a Sunday, and I had mass. I was telling you, I went to 2 masses that day, and I was like, oh my God, and this, and I remember my mom at the end of the conversation was like, I just wonder, do you ever go to a mosque? Like, to me, like, it doesn't, I truly don't feel like I'm compromising my Muslim identity whatsoever at all. If anything, I see the majesty of God. I'm humbled. Truly, I'm humbled because I'm like, wow, like all these people are just trying to figure out like their like relationship with the divine, and how cool is that? Like that you're actually giving that importance, So, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, Jessica, because I think I just missed your very first interview. So I would like to ask you, would you be able to reiterate your definition of peace? The meaning of peace.
The meaning of peace
Yes.
for me? I think I hold multiple meanings in terms of, I don't think it's just one thing. In a personal level, for me, from a very personal level, I think peace is rooted in faith. And that just comes from my experience as a practitioner of a certain faith, personal example or meaning of that. In a community level, I think peace cannot be achieved without justice. I think that's also important. A lot of times we talk about peace, but I think peace and justice go hand in hand, and I think that's important to keep in mind when we do bridge building and when we try to work with various communities. It's not to say that we'll achieve justice, but we need to have a conversation about what it means to also have that. To me, it's two sides to the same coin. And ultimately, I think peace has to be, again, I go back to that whole thing really about honoring each other, where it's a community. We have to, it starts on a very grassroots level for me. It's really, and it's not just honoring lip service, it's truly honoring each other as human beings. If you're working within a religious paradigm as a child of God, things like that. So for me, peace, again, on a personal level, it's very much rooted in faith for me. And I truly believe if you have peace within, then you will be able to somehow help create peace outside of yourself as well. It's not to say that you'll create world peace in one day, no, but you will be a proactive agent in trying to help create a peaceful world. And in a community level, I think when we have these conversations, I think peace and justice go hand in hand, and I think at the root of it is that you have to honor each other, honor as human beings, first and foremost.
Then, sorry, one more question is, I'm still struggling with that. 21st century is going more be individual world.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about the peace, if it means without violence or non-violence, people usually ignore or indifference. So it is hard to see there is more fighting or struggles between people. So do I have to be engaged in the situation to make them be a friend for creating peaceful world, or just let them be because they have no fighting or no conflict there? They seems like there is peace up there. So do you have some idea of that?
You'll have to ask the question
Okay,
one more time.
what I mean is, I'm Wes, okay, my name is Wes, and here's Hisan.
Mm-hmm.
If we have known each other, then I don't have to fight with them.
If you don't know him.
Yeah, right.
Sure.
So if I know about him and he does vice versa, we don't have fight each other, we don't have any conflict each other. It seems like we are in peaceful movement, peaceful situation. But we have to be engaged in defining or conflict in over there, community or interfaithful, interracial, stuff like that. But without any violence up there, do we have to be engaged in that in situation to make peaceful movement or peaceful stuff like that?
I don't think and correct me if I'm understanding your question or misunderstanding your question, but I don't think you have to be rooted in the conflict to be an agent of peace, to make, to somehow, help engage peace within that situation. I think that can be done from outside of that environment as well, take for you guys not knowing each other. Sure, if you don't know him, you don't know him, there's, we're just fine, I don't know you. But let's say one day someone says something very negative about him to you, right? You also don't know him well enough to say that, hey, that's not right. You know, like that's, are you sure about that? Because I know him and I know that he's not like that. You know, so again, I think for me, and again, I'm a community, you know, I'm a community organizer, so I'm all about engaging with the community. For me, engagement with the other is really a way to build bridges and to have peace, because then you know that person. Again, I love anthropology, clearly, as you can probably tell stories in anthropology, but like my secretary right now, she worked at, prior to coming in the position that she is in right now, she was secretary of her church, her Presbyterian church, for 16 years, you know, and then they had budget cuts and she was let go and whatnot. But she had never, growing up in Southern California, she had never met a Muslim in her life until her boss, you know, and then that was a, you know, interesting position for her. But what was really fascinating is about 3 months into the job, she had gotten an email, right, that said some very horrific things about Muslims, like, oh, they're this way, oh, they're that way. And I remember she came to work and she told me, you know, Malia, last night I got this email, and I have to say that before meeting you, I would have just, you know, either not responded, not done anything, or I'm ashamed to say I would have forwarded that to other people. But instead, what she did that time is she replied back and said, you know what, hey, listen, my boss is Muslim and she's so not like this. And neither are her family, neither is her community, right? So it humanizes it, right? So I think for me, you don't have to be in like the crux of like fighting and all of that to still be a participatory agent in creating peaceful relationships among people.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for joining us. I wanted to go back in time to that moment when you come, perhaps it was Harvard, the first time you were encountering other young Muslims and starting to build communities there. Just maybe to speak more on specific memories of what it felt like, how you built the community with other young Muslims, how that transformed you, but also maybe from that experience, another dimension of Islamic identity that you were able to articulate from that.
Mm-hmm. I think it made you feel, I mean, again, I had a very great support system at home, you know, in terms of my parents and things like that. But the moment you stepped out, right, and it was also a generational and a cultural thing, right, the whole immigrant generation versus the parent generation versus the immigrant generation, like in the study of anthropology, right, it's like we almost carry two different identities with us. You know, we're at school, we're speaking English like 8 hours a day, we're like, hey, what's up, da, da, da. And then we come home and our parents are like, what does that mean? You know, and then you switch to like Bangla. I'm fluent in Bangla because at home that's what we spoke. You know, to this day, you know, I speak in Bangla to my parents, to my mom, sometimes in English. So when you were on the outside or outside of your home, you almost kind of, you prepped yourself for like the diversity that you may encounter in terms of people seeing something, and you kind of felt like you had to defend yourself, right? Like by yourself, because there's no one else doing it, because there's no one like you. So I think when I came to Harvard, I was just like, wow, like there's someone, she also has a scarf, and then, or she's also Muslim, or here's this guy and he's Muslim, and you felt more, at least for me, it was kind of like you're not alone. You know what I mean? That there's this great big world. You knew it existed in theory because, you know, there's like a 1.6 billion Muslims. Surely you're not the only one. But at the same time, to see a large group of Muslims together, and a large group of Muslims that were doing great things, you know, like really they were just defying so many of the stereotypes that I encountered growing up. You know, you're forced to wear the scarf, you know, oh, you're oppressed because you wear the scarf, you know, things like that. No, not at all. Like these are, you know, for girls, those who chose to wear it, they wore it because they wanted to. And then equally there were ones who didn't, and that was totally fine too. You know, it didn't make them, in our, you know, in the community. And again, I think the student community, I mean, when you're in academia, stay in academia. Like, it's such, like, it is, it's like, you know, there's something very unique about it, you know, at least for me in my experience. So even amongst the Muslim community, even if you didn't wear the hijab or anything, you weren't a lesser Muslim. You were still Muslim and identified you as such, you know, and we shared this shared identity. That was really powerful for me because I never had that. You know, I never had like that communal, like a community identity of being Muslim aside from, my mother, my father, and my brother and I. So that to me was really, really, I was like, wow, if we can all just get together and if we can all be motivated by these moral precepts in our faith, we can rock this world for the good. And like, how amazing is that, So that's why, coming back, Selma was teasing me. So I was so excited to be back on campus. And she's like, what is wrong with you? Like, because I was like, wow, this is where, this is my class with this professor, and I was showing my husband everything. And, but then, looking back, it's because it was so formative for me. It wasn't the building. And I would argue it wasn't even the education. Not that it wasn't a good education, but it was the relationships, it was the people that I met. It was how they changed my mindset and, made me a part of a bigger picture when it came to my religious identity, when oftentimes it was a very small, almost a very lonely picture before. So it was great. I mean, I had a great experience.
Can I ask you maybe sort of a follow-on?
Yeah.
Who was the first Muslim that you met at Harvard?
Precious Rashida Muhammad. Oh, I love her. Google her. She's fantastic. African American. She was finishing her MTS when I started. And she was, I'm from Fulton, Missouri. Have you guys ever been to Fulton, anyone? You should go, but don't blink, you will miss it. So you should go embark in Fulton, Missouri. I mean, it's Fulton, Missouri, it's the Midwest. So I came here for orientation, and Precious was like, oh, I'm so scared for this girl. She's like, this girl coming from like the Midwest, coming to Boston, like, is she gonna be okay? So she's amazing. She like took me all around Harvard. She even pointed out like the crossroads that are the street crossings that I should never take because I could potentially kill myself if I do so. Like, this is where you should do this, where you should do that. And like, to me, I was like, wow. And for me, it was even like more fascinating because she was African American. I mean, like, we didn't have African, we had like a few, if that, but like, so it was just like, again, it just opened up my world. Like, wow, there's so many like dual identities, right? Like, you're not like this sole identity. Like, there's so many things that make you who you are, and that's like so great, and that's exciting, and that's how it should be. I think, you could be rooted in something. Certainly, I firmly believe that I'm rooted in my faith. I try to, be my best. Everything is motivated by that, but I'm also part Bengali. I'm married to a Pakistani. I live in LA. My education is rooted in Boston. I have friends from around the world, and that's great. I go to mass, and I go to the temple, and I go to like Shabbat dinners, and when I have time to the mosque. Yes.
Relationships are really important to you, and so is your faith. Would you say a little bit about how your relationship with God shapes you as a person?
Sure. If you know a little bit about the Islamic sciences, there's there's the text, the Quran, and then there's the hadiths, or the sayings of the Prophet, or attributes of the Prophet. And there's even more than that. There's some called hadith qudsis, who are like, they're like sayings of God that like God Himself said. And one of my most favorite sayings, and I always say this, and I remember this, is He said that I am to the believer as the believer perceives me to be, right? So to really think about that, and to me, I think that's profound. So in terms of my relationship with God, in Islam, it's not to negate that there are, this is kind of going into philosophy, but it's not to negate that in Islam there is the right of God versus the right of man, and the right of God, precedes the right of man. But in terms of a personal relationship with God, I've always felt like, if I see my God to be one who's most generous and most kind and just, that's my relationship with Him. And in Islam, there are these 99 attributes of God, and they say like, in your life, try to live these attributes in your life, right? Especially like there's good, not bad, He's just, He's also, He's just, but He's also kind. So like, be kind, be merciful. So for me, it shapes my relationship to everyone else as well, in terms of my relationship with God. And it's not easy. As Muslims, we pray 5 times a day, and we often talk about this, in the world that we live in, especially in like the real world, and I'm in my car going from meeting to meeting, and it's time to pray. I pull over and I pray, or, sometimes you lose what that means. But I think if you truly look at why those prayers are there, right? 5 times a day, Because why? Because you're reconnecting yourself to your Lord, right? You're rebuilding that relationship 5 times a day so that you're in check. Because it's very easy to like just be inundated when you're in school with, I overheard, I think you were talking about your papers and you know, and it was like PTSD for me. I was like, oh God, I remember that, you know, but, you know, or things like that. And I think, you know, that relationship, again, prayer is very core in the Islamic faith. And I truly believe it's meant to be that way because it does reconnect you with God. It's meant to cultivate that personal relationship with the divine. So I try my best, but it's not to say that, again, religion kind of sets these high precepts, and the whole point of life, I believe, is to try to reach that, right? It's a continuous struggle. Some days are great, and some days are just a horrible day, you know, but you start again. So I think, you know, the relationship with God is that relationship shapes my relationship with all of humanity as well.
I have a question on the prayers.
Yeah.
Would you mind to explain how they are done? Is it same time with other Muslims or it's your own time?
Sure. It can be done in congregation or by yourself, right? So akin to kind of within the Christian faith tradition where Sunday is like the, you know, communal Sunday services and things like that. The major congregational prayer is a Friday congregational prayer that happens. Other than that, you know, prayer can be done just by yourself. There are physical movements in prayer, which is also very interesting when someone catches you praying because they're like, what is going on? I used to pray on the 8th floor at Widener, and between these two aisles of books, right? And one part of prayer is you're completely in prostration, right? You're completely in prostration. And so I was in prostration, and I remember one of my classmates passed by and was like, Lilia, what did you lose? What are you looking for? What did you lose? You know, and I was in prayer, so I couldn't talk to him, right? So I'm like in sujood, and he's like, what happened? And then I like finished my prayer, and I turn around, and he's in frustration, right? Because he thinks I'm looking for something. So again, it's, you know, a facet of dialogue as well. It can attribute to dialogue. But yeah, so you can do it can be done in congregation or by yourself, and there's physical movements that are involved, and then in the prayer you recite basically from the Quran. So you have so you're always connected to that sacred text, right? So you recite parts of the Quran, and then there's personal supplication, which is kind of akin to like, oh God, you know, let me finish this paper, or you know, help me with this, things like that. So that kind of, you know, in a very very short, quick way, kind of explains prayer. I hope that makes sense.
I could ask another. When you speak, you shine with love and joy and all these wonderful things. But you've also spoken about times where you've been frustrated, or you say you joke about Missouri, but it was really hard.
Yeah.
Can you speak to throughout your life the role that anger and those some of the negative emotions and feelings, sort of moments when or points in your life where anger and was a prominent emotion, and has there been an evolution in your life where, because I don't, it's hard to see it in you.
Yeah.
I think it's. But maybe it's there, and maybe you've had an evolution where you've been able to handle anger, or you sort of use it for positive things.
You know, it's interesting. My husband can probably say I get angry, you know, but that's about affairs of the house. But in terms of like my work and like my experience, I honestly very seldom get angry. That's the honest truth. I'm not sure why. My brother has the same attribute, even better, which is amazing. But if I do get angry, it's because something was really badly done. And I'm not sure that it's even anger more than just hurt or shock. You know, I still get shocked at things like, oh my God, why did that just happen? You know, and then I have to kind of step back and realize, okay, this did happen, so like, what am I going to do to try to make it better? Because the thing is that you're right. Like, you can either, life gives you whatever circumstance it gives you, right? And your choice is, what are you going to do with it, right? What are you going to do with it? And in what way are you going to react to it that's going to be the most effective means, right? And especially when you're in community building and you're in community work. like, what is your motivating factor? This incident's happened. What is your reaction to it? And what is the cost-benefit analysis of that reaction? As human beings, sure, you get, like I said, I don't typically, and I pray that I stay that way. I don't typically get, it takes a lot. If you wrong my parents, I will be angry. That's one thing that does cause me, and I'm not. I think it's a combination of anger and hurt, because I'm like, you don't know what these people have gone through. You know, you do not have the right to make them feel this way, because you don't know who they were, and where they came to, and how they had to start from scratch, and who they are today. You know, I will say that is one thing that will make me angry. But people like mistreating me and things like that, it makes me more honestly sad and frustrated. We were just sharing this incident, and this just happened less than 3 weeks ago. I was in Long Beach, and I was going from to a meeting, and I parked my car, and then I was what in Paris? It was right after the incidents in Paris, right? I was parking my car, and I got out of my car, and I was going towards inside for a meeting, and I'm walking in the parking lot, and you can hear a car coming. You know, you can hear that a car is speeding, right? And so I'm like, la la la, you know, walking to my meeting, and then suddenly I hear this car getting closer and closer, and I'm walking this way, and he literally comes right next to me, where he like, basically I'm like, oh my God, and I run over to the side, and as he drives by, he says, you know, there's a special place in hell just for you, right? He didn't know who I was, but clearly I had a scarf on my head and things like that. That shook me a lot, you know, and more than anger, it made me very sad, because it made me think like, okay, like, what am I gonna do more that this doesn't happen again, right? So one of the things we did, actually, when I came back to the office, we have a Religion 101 series as part of our program. And so one of the things that we realized that we had to do is we have to create a program on Islamophobia, and we have to show what it is, and we also have to counter it by showing like who Muslims are. So that's a program that we're actually working on now, you know, and hopefully in May we'll have that, you know, set. So again, I guess it's how you look at it, you know, like maybe it was just a reminder that I was just getting too comfortable, you know, that there's still work that needs to be done in terms of education about Islam. You know, clearly this man didn't know me, didn't know, the only way that probably he knew me I was Muslim is because of my headscarf, tried to kill me, and then, you know, said this horrible thing as he walked by, or as he drove by. So more than anything, it makes me like wonder, God, like, it makes me sad in the sense that, wow, there's so much more that still needs to be done, you know? But then it makes you appreciate the fact that, you know, you're in a position where you can do something, right? Because others could have that circumstance that they might not have the venue or the facet to actually do anything. But here I am in this leadership position of this organization that does exactly that, you know, education, service, celebration, and this is going to be a program under education, and I'm going to utilize it, and I'm going to make something of it. But yeah, in general, I'm not always I'm not angry that much, but I don't know why. But I hope I don't get angry. but I do get. But again, if it's with my parents, I will. Otherwise, I'll get frustrated or I get very hurt. Maybe it's a Midwestern thing. I don't know. I don't know what it is, but it's okay. I like it, so I'll keep it.
If I could ask one more question.
Sure.
When you're telling your story, it just really seemed to me that there's so much, your childhood just seems so vivid to you still. And I'm wondering if that's something, as it continues to affect you today, if that's something that you bring to the table when you're approaching dialogue and, bridge building, like, what's the application of that?
Sure. No, you know, I've learned to do that more. When I first started my position, and you have to understand, I had just graduated from Harvard. Hello, you know, big words and all of that. So I remember I used to do these talks, and like, you know, everyone in the audience would just kind of be like, you know, they're not sure whether to clap or not, but they feel like it needs to be done because I just spoke. And then I realized the reason I did that is because I was using like hegemony and like, you know, the paradoxical thing and theology. And I was like, dude, this is not the audience for this. So the more and more I started engaging with people, the more I realized that the way that they really connect is by stories, right? Is by sharing who you are, right? And sure, your intellectual, the intellectual part of you, or that's a part of you, right? But on a very human level, people just want to connect on that human level, and I think stories are a very powerful way to do that. So more and more, probably after like the second year, I mean, the first year I probably just left everyone confused. Even in my little, you know, we have interfaith cafes, and I would, I would give the first like introductory talk about the cafe, and I would talk about history of like interfaith movement and all of this, and they could really care less is what I found out, because again, it's the audience, right? They're not students, they're not people who are trying to understand theology from a historical perspective. They're just trying to understand each other, and other faiths. So I think what I found is that, in fact, like the application of stories are so powerful, because I think that's how people can truly understand you and understand a principle, and then that, and then they share a story about themselves, right? Like, oh my God, something like that happened to me, or oh my God, I can't imagine what that must be, right? To have felt that way. And when someone says that, then you know that they truly are trying to internalize how that must have felt, right? And that's powerful. That's much more powerful than me printing out an article and saying that here's the analytical data about discrimination of Muslims in America, right? They're not gonna be like, oh my God, they're not, right? But when I share a story, they're like, oh, that must have been horrible. I can't imagine, but in fact they are imagining. And I think that experience for them is a lot more powerful. Because then if they ever, because we all stereotype, that's how we whether we like it or not, that's how we try to understand one another. But I think having felt my pain or my experience, I think it makes them think twice about someone else when they're trying to understand them, right? Or how they should react to them, someone being so different and things like that. So I found that, stories are very, very powerful, and I like to talk, so it's great. The dean is like, okay, time for it to go. Thank you guys so much for this opportunity. This is great.
Thank you so much for your time. Wow. We have a 15-minute break, and the other team is going to get together. Thanks so much to the three of you.
All right, well, we are here at Boston University School of Theology on April 7th, 2015. And we are here with Dr. Jennifer Peace. My name is Blake Fox.
I'm Kwang-Sik Kim. Yongjun Jeon.
And Dr. Peace, the appropriately named Dr. Peace, has been a leader in interfaith peacemaking since the 1990s and is currently an assistant professor of interfaith studies at Andover Newton Theological Seminary and a co-director of CIRCLE, the Center for Interreligious and Communal Leadership Education. And we are excited to hear some of the stories that have shaped you and your journey as a peacemaker today.
Great.
So first off, can you just describe a few of the significant events and moments through your journey as a peacemaker?
Sure. I guess the first thing I would say is that I would not probably call myself an interfaith peacemaker per se. I'm more comfortable with the term interfaith educator, and I think those are absolutely related occupations or activities. But I think there are many locations that one can choose to do this work, and the location that suits me is the educational setting. So my work really centers around teaching future religious leaders what it means to both be deeply grounded in their own religious identity and deeply committed to building bridges and relationships across religious lines. I think that's a form of peacemaking work, but I wouldn't, the way, say, Mark Gopin might describe his peacemaking work, it's a little bit different, and I think it's worth kind of making that distinction at the beginning. In terms of significant moments, I guess maybe there's three strands of my own biography that weave together into the kind of interfaith or interreligious educator that I am. One is the influence of my own Christian formation and my family life, my early family life. I was born in South Africa. My parents, both Americans, had gone over to South Africa for an indefinite period of time to be missionaries. And they had an interesting combination of a kind of a social agenda that opposed apartheid, so a sort of activist orientation opposing apartheid, and a conservative kind of Christian agenda to spread the good news. And they saw these things as very much connected, that there was a social justice mandate as Christians. They were called to live out their Christian lives in this way. So they went to South Africa and they started with some South Africans, an organization that was sort of dedicated to this twin work. And they had 3 kids while they were there. We were in all there for 8 years. And so really my earliest identity was as a South African. And whenever people use the word African American, I laugh a little because I think, well, I'm an African American. I was born in Africa. Anyway, it's a bit of a tangent. But I do think that that had a very formative influence on me in a couple of ways. One, that being a Christian meant doing something related to social justice in the world. It meant hitching yourself to things that needed repairing and actively working to repair. It also meant that if you were to take this identity seriously, it had a claim on your life, like your vocation was influenced by the fact that you called yourself a Christian. And I also really appreciated that this pairing of social justice and Christian identity was part of my early formation. The other thing I would say is my first experience growing up was being other, being white in a predominantly black culture, being American in a South African context. And when I came back to the States when I was 5 with this little South African accent, that itself was a big transition. And I think I understood being the other maybe in a different way than if I had just born and raised in the US. So, and I always had a lot of respect, and still do have a lot of respect for my parents, so that was very influential in my own formation. The second strand of influence for me, I think, was the early interfaith movement in the 90s. So you had a lot of international interfaith organizations springing up, and I was in Berkeley, California at the time, going to the Graduate Theological Union, doing my PhD work in the historical and cultural study of religions, which if they had a program called Interfaith Studies, that's what I would have signed up for. But I was really looking at, I had come out of my own seminary formation in Christian identity. I was really looking to understand sort of the stories and formation of folks in other religious identities. And I pretty quickly felt like this academic intellectual approach to understanding the religious other was pretty limiting and narrow and unsatisfying, and kind of not what I expected or was even looking for. I wasn't so interested in how we think about issues of ultimate concern, per se. I wasn't so interested in kind of a comparative theological orientation. I was really interested in people's experiences in the world, how they encounter each other, what those encounters mean to them, how they impact the way they live in the world. And I wasn't learning those stories in the classroom. So I got involved in a group called the United Religions Initiative, which was at the time just a fledgling organization. Bishop Swing, the Episcopal Bishop of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, was leading this. And I could say more about that, but what it did for me was really create this very rich, dynamic balance. As I was doing my doctoral work, I was very involved, especially as their youngest board member, bringing young people to the gatherings and being part of the conversation, in what it meant to do this work, this interreligious work with others, with other people. And actually, that's probably one of the most influential experiences for my own approach to interfaith work. It's very much relationship-based. You know, as My Neighbor's Faith sort of illustrates, it's very much about the people, more than the theologies or the ideas. So the movement had a huge influence on me as I came to my academic work. And then the third strand, if we look at family interfaith movement, the third strand is really my own academic and intellectual formation. And I increasingly became interested in what it means to form religious leaders adequately for the 21st century, for the context and time and place we live. And I became increasingly convinced that that has to include interreligious understanding, competencies, curiosity, and commitments, and that was not incompatible with a deep religious formation of one's own, a deep identity of one's own. And that had been my experience, and I felt very strongly that it was lacking in my seminary formation in ways that I felt like were no longer adequate. Like I didn't want to see in another decade, when new generations of religious leaders and professionals without some kind of training that included this awareness. So landing at Andover Newton in this partnership with Hebrew College was sort of a perfect location for me to start working out some of those intuitions and ideas about interreligious and religious formation. So a huge part of my work now is really thinking about how do we transform seminary education to reflect this necessity, I guess. So I've done work, in lots of different ways, trying to look at that both within our seminary and with others, partners here at BU and other folks who feel similarly. And I think there's increasing numbers of folks who have had this intuition from different directions and locations. And we're at a time, and I think even a location here in Boston, where a lot of that is kind of coming together. So it's sort of an exciting time in this whole interreligious education area.
Thank you. Could you elaborate a little on the second strand you named there?
Mm-hmm.
How you're moving from more of the academic or disconnected thought to having these moments of personal connection with others.
Yeah, sure. Let's see, the best way to do that. I guess, so I started out, what I realized in academia, you realize pretty quickly that understandably, the discipline areas have gotten pretty specialized. So there's a whole language, there's a whole methodology, there's a whole set of questions and concerns that are carved out by each discipline area. And so one of the things I found was the questions I was most interested in always seemed to straddle more than one department or more than one area. And that the way it had been carved out wasn't suiting me. So that was one piece of it. And the other piece of it was I just felt like the book knowledge, I guess I'm a person who learns a lot through my encounters with other people. I learn a lot interpersonally. And I felt like there was a limit to what I could learn on the written page. And I knew that when I was expressing things about my own faith identity, what I put in a sort of academic format was a pretty limited slice of what it meant to be me as a Christian in the world. And so I went on this sort of mini pilgrimage. It was my minister in my church. I was telling her how here I was doing doctoral studies and I was feeling sort of unsatisfied and was this the right path for me? And she sent me around to visit all these different folks who had taken slightly different paths. One was a church historian who was happily ensconced in her professional position and loved being a historian. One was a disgruntled academic who turned psychologist or psychiatrist. Another was this Episcopal minister in this little parish out in the middle of the Richmond district in San Francisco. And his name was Charles Gibbs. And he became the first executive director of the United Religions Initiative. But when I talked to him on my little pilgrimage, and I really went around and I was like, so what do you love about your job? What do you hate about your job? What do you think about academia in general? And I sort of had this very earnest list of questions. And when Charles started to talk about this emerging vision for a United Religions Initiative, which really sprang out of this kind of interesting, I'll tell you the short version of the story. The Fairmont Hotel is opposite Grace Cathedral on this hilltop in San Francisco. And it was at the Fairmont Hotel that the United Nations Charter was signed. And at the 50th commemoration of the signing of the UN Charter, the organizers thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could have, at Grace Cathedral, a gathering of the world's religious leaders, the United Nations, the United Religions. And the Episcopal bishop, who was is a very ambitious and sort of charismatic kind of person, was like, yes, we're going to start the United Religions, and delegates from around the world will gather. And very quickly he started to see the challenges and the fact that such a body didn't exist, and religions aren't really like nations, et cetera, et cetera. But he decided that there was such a need for the kind of interaction that this kind of a platform might afford, that he was going to hang in there and figure out if there was a model that might work, given all the complexities and realities of these religious identities and communities. So now it's a really large international organization that is organized around this cooperation circle model. And I wonder if it's not completely a surprise that the center I run is now called Circle, and their model is based on these cooperation circles. But at the time when I was talking to Charles, I got really just excited about the model. And I said, can I be a fly on the wall at your next organizing meeting? And before I knew it, I was appointed to the board without even realizing I'd been appointed to the board, and became very involved in the visioning and organization of that group. And out of that, I was asked to I was in my 20s, late 20s at the time, but I was still the youngest person involved. So it was an older crowd trying to think about new models. And they realized that young people needed to be involved. So I was involved with bringing groups of young people from different religious communities and locations. And we had a conference in Stanford in the early 90s, and one of the folks who came from Chicago, from the Parliament of the World Religions, who sent a contingent of young people, was Eboo Patel, who now runs the Interfaith Youth Corps. But it was at that little gathering at Stanford that this motley group of young people we had like ex-gang members from LA, and young women in their teens, and Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, Jewish. It was a really diverse group where the idea for the Interfaith Youth Corps was born. And so that work just became very relevant. It felt very relevant and very vibrant, and sort of the whole direction of why I was doing the work I was doing, why I was doing the studying I was doing, became much more tangible. I wasn't just doing it out of intellectual curiosity, though that certainly was a piece of it. I was doing it because, like any one of us can look around and see all the challenges in the world that often have this religious component, where you feel like if folks just understood each other a little better, if there were just some mechanisms for them to meet and get to know each other, some of this could be mitigated. We could do a little better. And I also felt this sense of responsibility as a Christian to do what I could to combat the kind of religiously motivated violence that sometimes is done in the name of Christianity in particular. So that's sort of a little more about that interfaith organizing work that happened in parallel with my own academic formation.
Thank you. You've mentioned a few, your parents, Eboo Patel, Charles, significant people of communities in your life. Are there any others you would like to mention or elaborate on any of those? Maybe your parents that helped shape you into the work you're doing today.
Well, one other person that I should definitely mention is Diana Eck, who's at the Pluralism Project at Harvard. There's a funny story about her and I. I actually went to Gordon Conwell in my seminary years, which, for anyone who doesn't know, it's up on the North Shore. It's part of the BTI consortium, and it's a very conservative Christian seminary. My father was teaching there at the time, as a professor there. And I did make extensive use of the BTI network, and I think I might be the only person who graduated with an MA in comparative religions from Gordon Conwell, because I cobbled together this very eclectic MA. But during that time, I saw in the course catalog a class that Diana was teaching about religious pluralism in Boston, and I read the course description, and I was like, that's the kind of course I want to teach someday. I want to meet this person. I want to be this person. I sort of saw in Diana a model of the kind of academic I wanted to be as well, because she had this wonderful field study kind of approach to the work where she would take students out to communities, to a Hindu temple, and that just wasn't really being done at that time. I mean, that was really, you see that a lot more in a lot of different courses, but that was pretty unique. And so I just wrote to her and said, hi, I'm a student at Gordon Conwell, can I come talk to you about your class and your work? And she wrote right back and said, I'd be happy to meet with you. Which, first of all, she endeared herself to me forever. Now that I'm a professor and I know how many random emails you get, like the number of times that this like cold call, you're just like, sure, come and meet with me. But she was so lovely and welcoming. And I had this whole thing written out how I wanted to sort of have impact on the local, national, and international level. And I would work in my local church and then the National Council of Churches and this interfaith. And she just listened and smiled and nodded and encouraged me and thought it was all wonderful and that I could do it. And so I'm forever grateful that she didn't just look at me and say, like, what are you talking about? Who are you? But, and then the wonderful kind of loop in that story is a couple years ago, and I've gotten to be good friends with Diana and the folks at the Pluralism Project, and she asked me to co-teach a class with her a few summers ago on religious leadership in Boston. So it felt like this just really lovely, maybe 15 years later, cycle. And she also, when Ibu and I were working a lot on the development of the Interfaith Youth Corps, he and I went and met with Diana and sort of asked her advice as a kind of mentor in this area. And again, just very encouraging. I think with this interreligious work, one of the imperatives I feel is that the folks who have established ways and places to do this within institutions, academia and otherwise, really need to be encouraging and bringing other folks up and along, even though there's more space that needs to be carved out. But I think Diana is just a great model of someone who actively encouraged folks to come along and find their way and their place in this work. And to imagine it anew. And now one of the other neat things that I'm doing that Diana's involved with is this group at the American Academy of Religions in Interreligious and Interfaith Studies that she's on the steering committee for. And again, she's like, let's break open the spaces, let's clear out the dead spaces of the academy, she's sort of both establishment and rebel rouser at the same time, and I think that's a nice combination for doing this work. If you want to make change, but also respect the sort of resources of the established institutions and figure out how to make institutional change. I think it requires some of that combination of reverence and irreverence, maybe. So she's been a big influence and a mentor for me. In terms of other people, I think, my parents' impact, it's one of those things that's just so foundational. I think the other thing I take from them both is sort of a curiosity that's not limited by what they currently know. And I think that's a really important quality in this work, that you cannot stop at any fixed point in terms of thinking you've figured it out, either in terms of your own theology, but also in terms of what it means to be engaged in this interreligious work. I feel like my understanding is continuing to be expanded in proportion to my willingness to let myself expand. So I think they modeled that for me. There were no questions we couldn't ask, like as deep as their faith was, it was not unquestionable. And they very much, I remember a conversation with my father, actually, we're driving in the car, and he said something about, I was asking some questions about Jesus and miracles and how he squared this with that, and he just said, I realize you have to find your own faith for yourself. That's not something I can give you. I can tell you what's happened for me and in my life, but I can't give it to you. And I thought that was such an important recognition, and I think it's true for each person, that faith isn't something that's inherited. If it's real and if it's living and it's authentic and it's yours, you have to find a relationship to it that you that's yours, that you own, that is deep. And so as much as these models and mentors matter and are essential for each of us, there's this work that you have to do yourself that can't be substituted. No one else can do that for you. And in some ways, the two areas of my teaching are interfaith studies and Christian spirituality. And I think that perspective, that way I come to this work, is reflected in those dual interests. Very much, it is very clear to me that I do the interreligious work better when I'm tending to my own inner life as a Christian. And that when I'm out of sync with that, all these other things come in, like ego, like, that's a big one. I think humility is one of the, if I had to make a list of qualities you need for interreligious work, humility would be near the top for lots of reasons. And I think a lot of the interfaith organizing work I've done, I've seen a lot of ego, both in the interfaith organizations and in the academy. And I think this work gets very, what's the right word? There's nothing that kills this work more quickly for me than when ego starts being what it's about. Because it can be kind of a power trip to be, I'm not just, exciting and saving all Christians. It's the whole world of religions who comes to me to learn how to peacemake and relate, and you run into a lot of that attitude. So maybe not a lot, but enough. So I guess that's actually something I would say I've also gotten from my parents, that they're humble people in a way, that that's a virtue in our family and our upbringing. So, yeah.
And you've sort of started to move towards my next question on your own. But I was wondering how you think your interfaith education work has been shaped by your distinct personality, or has shaped your personality?
That's a great question. Definitely, I mean, the models I gravitate towards, like at Andover Newton and taking this job, reflect a certain approach of mine. One is that I think I like to do this work from the standpoint of my own faith tradition with others who come from a commitment of their own. And when I was working in the United Religions Initiative, that wasn't always the case. There's real spectrum in terms of attitudes in interreligious work about what the goals are, what the approach is, and one of them is that we're all really one, we're all, it's all really ultimately the same. And for whatever reasons, part of it, my personality, my upbringing, that drives me crazy. I'm like, well, yeah, we're all human, we're all, but beyond that, what is fascinating to me is the differences. And I want to know that those are respected, irreducible, that I'm not trying to wipe out your distinctions and you're not trying to wipe out mine. I don't want anyone telling me that we worship the same God. I'm uneasy with that even in a Christian context sometimes, because I feel like it presumes so much. And I also don't like the idea that our capacity to work humanely and respectfully together requires or depends on some kind of acknowledgement of our sameness. Because I actually think that harmony is not predicated on sameness. In fact, if you use that as a metaphor in music, the difference in the notes is what creates harmony, right? So I kind of try to understand, and I think I do, where people are coming from when they're trying to highlight similarity, because a lot of it's been so much a clash of how we're different. But getting along should not require anyone acknowledging that they are somehow the same as the other person in any set of beliefs or ideas or attitudes or identities or so that's really core to me. Other ways, I think, as I mentioned earlier, because I'm so I learn a lot through interpersonal interactions. I mean, certainly I didn't finish my PhD program without learning also pretty well from books and such, but the learning that comes alive and that stays with me is almost always located in a particular encounter with an individual. So that really shaped how My Neighbor's Faith was organized and written, and it really shapes the way we frame our programming at Andover Newton and Hebrew College. So we're really interested in relationship building as the foundation for interreligious learning. And that you know how to speak to each other in deeper ways when you know each other. You know what questions to ask. You know what the person meant by their question because you know them. And you know that they didn't mean offense. And that you can say to them, well, that was really offensive, but I know you didn't mean it to be offensive. And I'm going to answer you because I care about you. But don't ever ask that question in the same way again to someone who doesn't know you, because this is how it will feel and sound to them. But that there's just this whole there's this whole territory, if you will, below the surface of the water, if you think of it like an iceberg, and that access to a lot of that deeper connecting and relating and conversation really has to come through the time you put into the relationship building. And so I also tend to try to think about, ways. We have this amazing opportunity on the Hilltop for people who are studying side by side for 3 to 6 years, right? We don't have many settings like that where you have kind of this interreligious neighborhood for that period of formation. So we're always trying to increase the points of interaction, random times that you're going to bump into someone in the classroom, outside the classroom, sort of more formal activities, more informal activities, and all of it is just geared to number of interactions, like however high we can get those. So we're starting this new initiative to create a circle house where people can meet and gather and stop in. And I really think friendship, you can't force friendship. You can't make people enjoy each other's company. But you can set up conditions where that's more likely to happen. And so that's what we're always thinking about. What would be fun? Like, we have music rehearsals in the Circle House, so people who play instruments are going to get to know each other that way first, and then be like, oh, what does it mean to play this music in a Jewish setting, or what kind of learning might happen spontaneously there. So that has been a huge core of, it's a huge part of who I am, and it's a huge way I do the interfaith work. Which also means I can get a little critical if I feel like a model is too utilitarian, too just like, I guess the version of this that sometimes I'll get a phone call and someone will say, I need a Muslim for a panel I'm putting together. And then I call something. I will not put my friends in those situations anymore. I will talk to the person about what they think they need a Muslim for and what that means to them. And I'm also increasingly uninterested in one-off events, because I think it's an enormous amount of work and energy for very little long-term impact. And that in fact, you may reinforce stereotypes without knowing it. You may be kind of creating this model of all Muslims think because you've met this one person now. And unless it's, I don't honor those kinds of requests unless I know the folks, and unless the folks have spent time getting to know me. And I read this somewhere, it's one of those like slogans, and I'm not a big mottos kind of person, but I liked this, the sort of measure of someone's character is how they treat people from whom they want nothing. And I'm always thinking like, what kind of knowledge do you have of me and do I have of you to know that's the kind of person you are, so that I'm going to want to extend myself and help you, or tell you about things that matter to me. That's the other kind of interfaith work that sometimes drives me crazy, is that we get folks we don't know at all into a room and we say, tell me about your most intimate experience of the presence of God, or whatever it is. And people are unbelievably generous often about like sharing those things, but I sometimes feel like it's that casting pearls thing where it's just like, you know what? let's just slow down. These are sacred stories. These are, the atmosphere and spirit needs to be developed accordingly. Is this really going to be honored? One of the, I guess almost it's just sort of maybe a downside of the increasing interest in this work is that I see a lot of that, like, I just need to do this, and then somehow we've made whatever that organization or community is interfaith, and we put that word on it, and we're covered. And I think it's really a lot less exciting. It's slow and steady work of getting to know each other over a long period of time. But ultimately, that is so much more powerful and so much more transformative if what we're really talking about is changing our understanding of each other and ourselves through this work. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
One question I have is, in your life so far, what was the most important contribution you have made to Just Peace, and why?
Oh boy. Yet to come. No, important contribution. I guess I would like to think that I'm helping lay a foundation for institutional change. And an institution will outlive any individual, hopefully, in these times, you never know. But even the privilege of being one of the people maybe who's helped sow the seed of the idea. I know this sounds like a small thing, but I see how the potential for it to grow is big. The sowing the seed of the idea that maybe the way we've always trained seminary students is not adequate, and maybe part of what's not adequate is that it doesn't have this deep and lasting commitment to interreligious understanding and skill set. And that in another 20 years' time, if you're examining the curriculum of any seminary, you're going to find some layer that includes interreligious understanding as a core value. That would be a huge shift. I mean, coming from the evangelical context that I was raised in, and my father he's professor of evangelism at Fuller Seminary. So I understand that this is kind of a major paradigm shift in a lot of, especially branches of Protestant Christian community, if we just think of that community for a time. But I see this slow, steady movement in that direction. I see a kind of understanding that we cannot continue sort of training religious leaders with these blinders on, that there's anyone else in the world that thinks differently religiously, and if they do, the only relationship I can have to them is conversion, or the attempt to convert. And I feel like I have been given an opportunity in the location where I am to have some influence on that conversation. And that's really satisfying to me. And I have no illusion about how complex that is or how many other people that needs to involve. But if I think about what I would be proudest of in, say, 20 years' time looking back, it would be like, yeah, I helped push that ball in that direction. So, yeah, institutional change is becoming, I don't know, as you age, you get more interested in that sort of thing. Like, I used to want to tear down the walls of the university and break open the classroom doors, and I'm like, wow, there's some power in this institution that has lasted so long. How could we nudge it? I see it like an ocean liner. How could we nudge it? Not blow it up, not tear it down, not just protest it or wish it was different, but influence it. And being on the faculty and in that position, I have a little ability to influence it. And so that's the kind of, and again, I don't know if I'd frame that as just peacemaking work, but certainly educational work with an eye towards greater justice, maybe.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you for sharing your experience and your work. And this time, please let me ask you, what crisis have you had until now as a peace builder?
I'm physically inadequate.
Yes.
Before just human beings. So I'm going to let me ask you personal level and the community level first. Okay. Personal level. From your lecture at GTU 2013 February.
Yes.
You mentioned about great discernment from your mother-in-law.
Yes.
And from the speech at the UCC Council 2009 October, and I have felt your struggle between your evangelical heritage from your parents and your work.
Yeah.
So you might have very hard time and serious crisis in your life until now. So can you share?
It's interesting. You would think that there'd be more challenge related to this evangelical interfaith piece. My father and I have joked about writing a book called, from evangelicalism to interfaith, evangelical and interfaith. We're working on the pronouns, but I would just say first that the thing I'm fascinated with that I think those two paradigms have in common is how do we as Christians orient toward the religious other. Interfaith and mission work are actually two maybe different answers to similar questions. And in a funny way, missionaries were like, you have the armchair anthropologists and the field workers, you have the armchair theologians, and then you have the missionaries who are actually out there being influenced by other people. There's a relational quality that I do think has something similar to what I'm interested in. But crisis-wise, I would actually go back to more of a personal crisis of faith that I wrote about in My Neighbor's Faith a little bit. I think for me, I don't think I would be doing this work if I hadn't had that personal encounter with the divine that I wrote about. So for me, interfaith work comes out of my deeper connection to my Christian identity. So in a way, they're not actually incompatible. I had what could be framed as a kind of classic conversion experience, although it was a little different since I wasn't converting. I had just sort of faded away from my Christian identity, let's say that. Growing up, it mattered enormously to me. In college, I sort of was like, well, obviously it's not real. I mean, it's not a bad set of ideas, but come on, we're all sophisticated grown-ups. And then when I went to London and I was at this very evangelical, sort of rowdy Anglican church, they do exist. It's still there, Holy Trinity Brompton. I went last summer for the first time again. It is a trip. If you are in London, go to Holy Trinity Brompton. But that challenged me to say, do you believe this? And the funny thing I was just reflecting on recently, my trip to London was a year-long study experience. And at the beginning of the trip, or the beginning of the year, I was in an exercise class. And this random woman said to me out of the blue, "Are you a Christian?" So weird. And I said, "No." And that was surprising to me. But I felt like I couldn't authentically claim it because it had become so distant to me. The end of the year, the same woman in this exercise class randomly says to me, as if she's forgotten we had this conversation, "Are you a Christian?" And I said, "Yes." It was the darndest thing, but I think it was this beautiful bookend for me to recognize that my identity had shifted and my willingness to identify as a Christian had shifted irrevocably. Like that really changed who I was. And it changed, I went to seminary because of that experience, I went to graduate school, and I became this interreligious educator because of that experience. And nestled in that experience, as I wrote about it too, was to me this beautiful, God has the best sense of humor in my experience. Because here I was, this evangelical kid who'd been like, forget it, God's not real, I've been duped, this was foolish, goes on this retreat, has this numinous encounter with the divine where I'm like, okay, I get it, you're real, I was wrong, committing my life to you again, sort of return to my evangelical roots. And then the next day, the Monday after the retreat, my Muslim friend says to me, when I decide to witness to my conversion and maybe bring him to God, I have a friend who cried for 3 days and is now devoted to Allah. And I was just like, no, that is not what I'm talking about. But 20 years later, and that, again, sowing those seeds, at the moment of my most particular encounter, that I was beginning to reframe using my childhood paradigm of this God and the Christian evangelical understanding of God, was sort of ripped open in a way I was not ready for and didn't really understand at the time. But it shifted my trajectory. It gave me this understanding that, as I put in the book, God is greater. This is where the humility comes back in. I cannot deny the power and reality of that experience. That was true. It's had this lasting effect on my life, and I don't understand it at all. Like I couldn't possibly say that that theologically I could contain and name that experience in a way that's perfectly neat and tidy. So it's this funny paradox. It's both the most particular Christian encounter and the moment that broke open sort of every possibility in terms of what the divine is and what this means for my life. So I actually don't see those being in tension, as weird as that sounds. One of the essays I wrote is an evangelical interfaith imperative ? Because I think it's out of taking this stuff very seriously that we take each other very seriously. If I thought all of this was foolishness, I'd probably think your version of it was foolishness, right? That a part of interreligious respect is having a respect for my own religious commitments and identity, and some humility about what that means for you. Other than to be in open dialogue and to be as honest as I can as we build our relationship. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's
Cool.
good.
Thank you. One more question I have. I think you have had two gigantic challenges, one from outside and the other one from your group. So your side.
Yeah.
So you have to talk with the other religious group, and also you had to portray or resolve some different opinions from your Christian group also. So can you share, you have some hard time and crisis with both of them?
That's a good question. I had one experience that comes to mind was when I went to Fuller Seminary to talk about my book, the edited book, My Neighbor's Faith. And what I loved about the group of students who gathered was they were just so enthusiastic and very respectful and earnest, but at a certain point one of the students said, I get it, interfaith work is a new way to missionize.
Oh no.
And I was just like, that is exactly what my Jewish friends are worried about. And we could laugh about it because they had the same reaction. And it allowed me to sort of say to them, listen, the goals are different and the boundaries are essential. So if your idea is that you're going to somehow trick people into relationship building and then convert them to Christianity, you really need to not do that. I'm not usually very didactic, but that's where I was just like, it's a betrayal of trust. And your job is not to, and I grew up in the evangelical frame, so I can say, God converts people, you do not convert people. Your job is to witness to God's love in your life, to be love to other people. And if that invites folks to learn more about what you have that they want, then that's Christian witness. But if your goal, and then I said the other thing about interfaith work that's essential to me is you have to have an honest commitment to mutual transformation. So as interested as you are in exciting someone about the reality of God's love in your life and what that's done, you need to be able to listen to You know, I was talking to a friend today about what it feels like for her to have been reading the Bhagavad Gita to her grandmother the last 5 minutes before she died. And sort of what the power of that scripture in her grandmother's life. You have to be open to those encounters just as much as you're asking people. And if it's not that two-way street, do not enter into this work. You will be changed by it. And if you're not available to be changed, A, I don't think you're being consistent with your own Christian commitment. And B, you have no business doing interfaith work. Do something else. Call it mission work. That's okay. Be explicit. Be upfront. And then people can choose if that's what that's a conversation they're showing up for. So I think with my own evangelical community, that's one challenge. The second challenge is just getting them to care, to feel like it's relevant, to feel like it matters. What does it have to do with me? And that, I frame this work as consciousness-raising work. And I believe strongly as an educator as well that you never force someone into a place that they are not. It's invitational. It's suggestive. It's I want to provoke people's curiosity, but I would never. It's not about forcing anyone anywhere. And so I do feel like when I'm in settings where I'm with people more from the evangelical community, people are curious. They've heard this word interfaith. I mean, there's a journal at Fuller, for example, that the students have started that's an interfaith focus. And they're figuring it out too. What does this mean? What does this have to do with us? But I try to tread lightly. It's not my business or place to. In fact, it kind of is funny, comes out of a sort of evangelizing impulse to force everyone to see the value or goodness of this particular work. I've met people who do interfaith work in a, to me, very off-putting, kind of intense way, where it's like, yeah, I get it, it's good, I agree, I actually do this work all the time. But, you know, it's about, I really like to just share my experiences, and that's where it goes back to the relationship building, and motivations and intentions, and all of that, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jennifer.
You're
for
welcome.
being here
Pleasure.
And sharing with us your rich story. Despite the challenges that you have shared, I believe in some of this journey, there are moments of joy. Would you mind to share some of the moments of joy in your journey?
Yeah, moments of joy. One story that comes to mind that is actually both a little bit of a challenge and a joy. Increasingly, I am realizing how much I have to learn, and I think the interfaith movement has to learn, from folks who have done other consciousness-raising work. Again, I use that phrase. So, anti-racism work, anti-sexism work, people who have been discriminated against because of an aspect of their identity. So religious bigotry, I would put into that whole circle. And part of interreligious work is kind of learning the skills and strategies and consciousness around dismantling bigotry in all of its forms. So I was at an interfaith conference with the United Religions Initiative back in the 90s, and there was this moment in the conference when a man stood up in the middle of the esteemed gathering of bishops and, you know, all sorts of folks from around the world. It was this very kind of tense, weird kind of first meeting, and everybody was like, what are we doing here? What is this United Religions Initiative? And this guy stands up and he says, my name is Christian. Talk about like your appropriate names. His name was Christian, and he was a Christian, and he was from San Francisco. And he said, I am a gay man, and I have not felt safe or welcome at this conference that's supposed to be about harmony and relationship building and peacemaking. And there was just this like, you know, it was a very carefully scheduled conference, and he was speaking out of turn and standing up in front of these like 450 delegates, and people were just like, you know that tingly silence when you're just like, nobody is comfortable right now? Some people stood up and left, like just visibly like, I can't even be in this room. And other people just sat there like, what's gonna happen? And he went on like a 5-minute monologue about his identity as a gay man and as a Christian, and how he needed to just tell people the kind of hostility he was experiencing. And he got choked up at a certain point as he started, the silence was just like dense. And at that moment, all these women, these indigenous women who were at this conference, who I don't know how much of his actual speech they understood, was that most of them, English was third language or fourth language. They rushed up as like a group and surrounded him in this embrace and like hugged him. And he was sobbing and they were sobbing and we were all like, oh my. And we were aware that something was happening. There was this bigger spirit that was inhabiting this space with us, and it was a very, very amazing moment. And then they broke away, and Christian's standing there, and he said, and before I sit down, and we're all like, oh. There's one more thing I have to say, another point of injustice. He said the young people at this conference have been bumped 3 times. They were supposed to open this prayer with prayer. They keep getting bumped. Someone more important keeps being foregrounded, and it's not right. And the young people need to have respect too. So he says, Jenny, would you come up here and pray for us? So into this fraught, crazy, tense moment, and I'm like 20-something, and I have never been more speechless in my life. I couldn't not walk up there because I just witnessed this act of courage and this infusion of spirit, and so I just stood there completely speechless, and finally I just remembered opening my hands like this, like I have nothing, and I said, you know, will you pray with me? The young people had all prepared an opening prayer, but like he said, we kept getting bumped and pushed off. And from all sides of the tent, they all came up and gathered, and we formed a circle, and we did this silent prayer that had sort of a kinesthetic element to it that just knit together that space and sort of healed what had been ripped open a little in a way that is probably one of the most powerful prayer experiences of my life. And so joy tinged with a lot of terror and a lot of like anxiety, but I think this work at its best invites you to be your biggest self and invites you to go to the edges of where you think you're kind of capable and to remain authentic. And I am not an interfaith prayer person, so we spent a lot of time with that group of young people figuring out how we could all authentically participate in something that felt prayerful but was not overwriting any of our own theologies with someone else's theology about what it meant to pray. So it's always been ironic to me that that was kind of one of the most sacred moments I've had in an interfaith setting. And it broke open a lot of my own ideas about what the work was about and for. And I feel grateful for that to this day. So yeah, it's not a simple joy, but it was certainly a joy. I don't know if that helps.
Do you have anything else to add to the discussion?
In general, or as another joyful moment?
In general, that you think maybe we didn't ask you.
Oh, anything that you didn't ask me. I know you told me to be prepared for that question. Of course, I didn't prepare for that. I guess one thing I would just say is that I would encourage all of you to think about the way your own study and your own vocational paths intersect with this area, this body, this field, and the kind of contribution that you might have to make from whatever vantage point you're coming from. I think, you know, as your questions all suggested, this work is very much influenced by the mix of the folks who come to the work and the people and what they're bringing to the work. And we need all of you. I think this work is new enough And it's big enough that it needs sort of the collective intelligence, the collective hearts of everyone. So I guess the word I would just add is to encourage all of you to find your place and your voice. It's still being defined. And what I think that's a beautiful place to be. I mean, academia, they tend to like pin things down and define them and categorize them. But if you remember when I was talking about what turned me off when I first started doctoral work, it's that same kind of narrowness. Like, that has a place, and I understand it, and there's a development there that's important. But we're in this beautifully open place and space where I think it can be infused with a lot of life and energy and a lot of concerns and cares that each of you see and bring to the work as we think about what it is we're here to try to repair.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now we have a few minutes to open it up to questions to anyone in the class.
I heard you speak a lot about the importance of personal identity and cultivation of that identity.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what practices you engage in, be they from your faith tradition or otherwise, that help you with that cultivation.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm on sabbatical right now, which itself is a wonderful practice. It's really hard work. No. But I'm writing about interfaith work right now. And what's been interesting to me is I started the project in a very head academic. You should see my outline. I mean, it's beautiful. It's got page numbers and pace, and that's linked to my calendar. And after a month, I was so bored by the project that I couldn't even, put fingers to keyboard. And I kind of gave up. And it felt like a very spiritual, it was almost a surrender. It was like, I give up, God. I can't, this is beyond me. This task is beyond me. And I kind of played hooky for a week. And during that week, one of the practices is listening. And during that week, 3 women from my life appeared. A former student, a colleague I've never met in Minnesota who wrote to me out of the blue, and a grad school friend from 25 years ago. And all 3 of them asked me about one class that I taught once in 2013. So the student had taken the class, and she said to me, out of the blue, we were catching up and hadn't seen her in a year and a half. She just broke into the narrative and said, that class you taught on feminist spirituality through an interfaith lens was the most important course I took in seminary. And I was like, wow, thank you, but all right. Next, 2 days later, this woman from Minnesota writes to me and says, I was looking on the internet and I found this syllabus on the Anna Newton course website for this class called Feminist Spirituality Through an Interfaith Lens. Have you written anything on that topic? And I wrote back no, not really, but thanks for your interest. And again, I didn't quite think much of it. And then 2 days later, this grad school friend contacts me out of the blue, says, I've taken a new job, and my dean of faculty wants me to teach a course related to women and religion with kind of an interfaith twist. Have you taught anything like that? It sounds like the kind of class you would teach. And as soon as I got that third, I don't know, Christian, I work in threes. If I get 3 messages, suddenly I'm paying attention. So that really was that I surrendered, and I got 3 these very different kind of random messages, and I totally reframed my writing. And the way I reframed it was, the powerful thing about that class was that the methodology, the approach, and the content were very much in sync. So I used a feminist pedagogy to teach the class. The content was about feminist contributions from within various religious traditions. I invited my friends from these traditions who were women and feminists to visit the class, and it was so much fun. And I threw in my love of art, my quilting, my pottery. I just was I put everything I loved in a pot and sort of mixed it around and wondered if I'd get fired or if anyone would be interested. And it felt risky, and I think risk is a huge quality in this work, actually. I feel like if you are taking risks in that way that feels right for you but a little scary, you're probably on the right track. So what it said to me is you need to write this book in a way that's actually consistent with what you're trying to say. And the way I was approaching it was like, I'm going to look really smart and write a smart book about interfaith. And I was super bored by it. So what happened was I changed my practice, and I spent, one thing for me, writing is very much a spiritual practice. So I would write for 2 pages every morning, just really free write. What's happening? Where's my heart? Sometimes it often ends in a little prayer. And then I would sit, or I do sit for 10 minutes in prayer. So I do the free writing, I pray for 10 minutes, and essentially it's like, what are we going to write today, God? Like, this work is for your glory, for your benefit. I turn it over to you. It's not about me, what needs to be written here. And my writing just like has opened up. It's been a joy, it's been fun. I changed the title from Understanding Interfaith Work to 48 Short Stories about Interfaith Work. And I turned 48 a couple weeks ago, so it's all about me and not about me. But what I realized is that the way I approach this work is very much through these encounters, these moments, and that in a way, what the book I needed to write was the raw data. How did I come to my understanding of interfaith work? This story, and this story, and this story. And at the end of the collection of all those, and I'm on about 28 stories by now, I'm going to see what's there. It's revealing something to me that I don't currently know about the formation of this work in my own life and experience. That's the best kind of writing, but it's scary writing. Like, the outline, I knew what the book was going to look like at the end. I have no idea really what this book's going to look like at the end. But you know, what are they going to do? Fire me? So I'm up for tenure right now. They're voting on the 13th, so we'll see. But just in answer to your question, I think reminding myself to return to my practices was really important. And it was a friend of mine who's Christian and who's in this Daughters of Abraham book group of mine who was talking about her own writing. And she said, I was having a lot of trouble with the writing, and then I started to pray before I wrote, and I was like, oh yeah, gotta do that. So prayer is huge for me. I take it, it's very powerful in my own life, and for some weird reason, I have to be reminded of it all the time. But this sabbatical is giving me a chance to go back to that practice. Reading the Bible is actually a part of my practice too, which surprises me in a little way because I came from a sort of approach to the Bible that wasn't quite, I was always fighting against, frankly. I was like, what do you mean? And then God had to kill all the firstborns. Does anyone else get bothered by that? I'd be like, Professor, God's ways are not our ways. I'm like, no. It ends with all the firstborns being killed. I'm sorry. So I came from this very contentious relationship to the biblical text to understanding this very, what's the right word, spacious, maybe, relationship to the text. That there's many ways that God can speak to me through people, through my prayer, and through Scripture. And I've had that experience, and whenever I make myself available for that experience, I'm continually surprised by the revelation and resource that's in there. So, so that's another part of my practice. And the last thing I'd say is deep conversations with people who I love, who love me, who care about the work. And some of those are with co-religionists, and some of those are interreligious. And those are another part of the practice for me. Back to the question. Yeah.
This question is actually inspired by an encounter I had 30 minutes ago.
It's very fresh. That's good.
I was wondering if you could maybe speak to a certain memory or experience where you encountered another religious tradition and it gave new meaning to one of your own.
Well, of course, I'm thinking a lot about the one I wrote about, but I've already talked about that. because of the work I do, I have so many kinds of encounters every week that are maybe very small, but some of them end up having big ripple effects. So I'll give you one example. In January, I was teaching a class with my co-directors, one Muslim, one Jewish, and myself, teaching about religious leadership in Boston, Jewish, Christian, Muslim perspectives on religious leadership. And there were many, many moments in that class, because the classroom was Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Unitarian, and the co-directors were co-teaching. So there were lots of moments I could speak to. One that sort of like has stayed with me was so simple. There was a student in the class who's Muslim. She's from Cairo originally. And she said, at some point in our conversations, she just said, she was reflecting on coming from Egypt to the US and the different kinds of encounters she was now experiencing in this very different setting, and how that was changing her ideas about what it meant to be Muslim, what it meant to not be Muslim, what her role was as she's studying at Al-Azhar, Al-Azhar, very, very smart, fluent in Hebrew, Arabic, English. I mean, she's going to be in academia in some way, or teaching and learning. And she said, your experiences change who you are. And the first time she said it in the class, we were all just like, yeah, good point, experience change who you are. And then we were going on as this week-long intensive, and something else came up in the conversation, and she said, and she spoke almost not at all during this class, she's a very quiet person, but I know her a little outside of class, and she said, your experiences change who you are. And I feel like there is so much wisdom in that very simple statement, that it's so relevant for interreligious education and everything I think about why and how you do this work, that to me it was a very profound insight that I both knew intellectually, and it's sort of simple, but the implications of that are huge. So what experiences do you allow yourself to be present for? What experiences do you put yourself in the way of, in the line of? What experiences as a instructor do I create for others, the possibility of experiences? And I think there's both anxiety and great hope in that reality, that our experiences change who we are, for good and for ill, processed and unprocessed, conscious and unconscious. And I think one of the ways that I also apply that insight to the work I do now, and even in the writing that I just described, is sometimes we can't speak to each other well in a moment because of the differences, because of all the baggage, the resistance, the tensions. But often if you go back to people's experiences and say, I notice you feel so strongly about that. What experience led you to believe that all Christians are proselytizing, or whatever the perspective is that you're finding hard to relate to? If you step back and ask for that primary data, like what experience led you to that? And then Ray Helmick, who, I don't know if his name has come up, but he's a wonderful just peacemaker who did a lot of work in Northern Ireland and is a Catholic priest. He has this great line that he uses in interfaith work that relates here. He says, if he finds these impasses with people, he'll say, my experiences have not led me to the same conclusions that your experiences have led you. And it's just a wonderful way of acknowledging that there's some differences here, and we both have experiences that are profoundly forming and shaping to who we are. And maybe if we can put those experiences on the table, we'll learn a little bit more about sort of the richness of who each of us is, and how this particular conclusion or this particular urgency or insistence has been distilled from this vast experience, because experiences are complex. But sometimes what we take away from them is very particular. And we see those as immovable aspects of our own identity sometimes. But if you can invite people to back up a little and go back to that data before we've leapt to this conclusion, I find that that's a much more, the potential for meeting space is much greater there. So, it's maybe not a classic way that I changed my own religious understanding, but I think it was an example of that kind of openness to an interfaith encounter, really a human encounter, that that created a new layer to my own understanding about it.
Yeah, I remember you spoke about the religious leadership, and I was wondering about what kind of leadership we need in terms of when we're dealing with the peace community, because even you faced with the religious community, there are some conflicts between others because someone has to choose a goal, or in your community, some members have some struggling with different ideals or different opinions. So, because I've learned about this class, the adaptive leadership is better than, I believe it is better than the problem-solving leadership. But I'm not sure it is how practical in the circumstance processes, not just intellectual concept. So, do you have can you speak something about?
Well, I don't know if I can speak very intelligently about different models of leadership. I probably should, I get my dean, Sarah Drummond, who does leadership stuff in here. But I guess in broad terms, I'm concerned with the kind of pastors we're putting in the pulpit, for example, and the ripple effect that the one's presence and style and sermon has on the community that you're leading, and then everyone relating to the folks who are part of those communities. So I guess really not being steeped in this sort of models of leadership stuff per se, I look for what qualities or characteristics am I trying to encourage or help foster. Catherine Corneille's book, The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue, one thing I like about that book is by introducing these, she calls them conditions for interfaith dialogue, like humility, empathy. She's pointing us towards the kinds of qualities of character, maybe, that an individual can embody that I think are effective for leaders. So curiosity is always way up there on my list. Humility is always way up there on my list. I want to see leaders who are also very good at knowing the limits of their own understanding and have the skills to connect to folks in their expanded networks who aren't just Christian, for example. So they might be able to say, we're planning this gathering and this is the outline of it, and as my favorite rabbi, I'd love your take on what an interfaith Thanksgiving service, really means to you. So some of it's just interpersonal skills. And then I guess the other thing I would say is I'm a big believer that your leadership style has to fit you. I've seen so many people who are trying to be a particular kind of leader, and they're lousy at it because it's really not who they are, right? And it goes for teachers too. I mean, I remember taking classes at Harvard Divinity and seeing some of these professors who were brilliant lecturers, but suddenly they were told that they had to do this like shared learning, and they had no idea how to do that. And I was like, just lecture. Lecture. You're really good at that. So I think the world can use a lot of different kinds of leaders, and that the point for me is that there's an authentic connection, that you're leading in a way that's authentic to who you are. Now, with certain caveats, like I am not a fan of the dictator model, for example. And I do remember a point when I was spending a week down at the Holocaust Museum in DC, and I was thinking, Hitler was an incredibly effective leader, and I'm cultivating leadership, and I do not want to inadvertently contribute to the skill set of someone. So I actually think leadership requires enormous discernment and connection to community so that your own ego and your own delusions of what the world would be like if everyone just did things the way you thought was best, and if they could just see that that was going to be this beautiful world and come along with you, it'd be great. And you can get some pretty awful leadership styles coming out of that conviction. So I'm much more of a community, I guess the last piece I would add to that is leader of who? To whom are you leading? Or who are you leading? Who do you think you're leading? And do they agree with you? Do they see you as a leader? What is the community asking of you? And to whom are you accountable? So leadership is never just in a vacuum. It's never, I am a leader. It's very much relational. It's very much about what you're being called to, the role you're being called to play. And I think it's important to always, certainly as a Christian, servant leadership is my dominant model. So you're called to certain roles and responsibilities when you're in leadership. But one of those is to be giving away power as much as you can, in my opinion. So how do you empower or allow space maybe for others to express the full bounty of what they have to offer? I really think the best leaders have this ability to unleash people's own motivations and energy and ideas and commitment and connection. So, yeah, that's what I would say. I saw someone over there too. I don't know what order.
I'm about to leave, so I'm just gonna throw this out there. It's multi-layered just because it's a live issue for me as a mother, but I've been wondering a lot what interfaith work, education, peacemaking means in relation to children who are constructing their identity, and my role as a mother in helping my child construct his identity without indoctrinating him. I mean, coming from an evangelical background, I'm very thankful for the biblical literacy that I received, but I was also indoctrinated and have, the Bible drill trophies to prove it. So,
memorizing scripture verses.
Yeah. So, anyways, I offer that.
Great question. I'll do a really short answer. My husband, I found out when we did premarital sort of counseling with my pastor that he considered himself an agnostic Buddhist. And I'm like, I'm not even sure that's a thing. And at this point, we've been dating 7 years, and I'm very steeped in my Christian identity, but he was not raised, he's more of a secular humanist. And I have 2 boys, 12 and 14, and it's very important to me that they understand that Dad's a good person and that we share a lot of ethical concerns, but that our orientation to religion is very, very different. And I try to be as honest as I can about its significance and role in my life. And I talk to them about these things and questions, and so does my husband. And it might be more complicated for them, but I almost think of it like kids growing up in bilingual houses. Maybe they learn to speak a little later, but they're fluent in both languages. And so choice and honesty are really important to me. Exposure, choice, honesty. And I am not the fan of, I've had some Sunday school teacher friends who are like, don't confuse the kids, just tell them ABC when they're little, it's just not my approach. I feel like they can screen what they're able to take in and understand as they go along, and they get a greater picture of the complexity. But yeah, honesty, exposure, and that's sort of, we'll see how it turns out. They're 12 and 14. One of them does not like church at all, and the other one is, on the fence about it, so. There and then there, yeah.
Okay, One of the questions I have for you is, I'm also interested in sort of the intersection between higher education and peacemaking, wherever that is. And personally, I'm interested in the relationship between Christianity, mysticism, and the arts. But I was wondering, one thing that is fundamental to me, and I was interested to hear you talk about a lot, was how important experience was in the way that we learn. So differentiating between intellectual knowledge and experiential knowledge. I would just, is there like, what are the ways that you apply that in the class to just sort of enrich the experience? And I also have another question afterwards.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll
Ask
take
the
too
second
long.
one now so that I.
The second one I have is, you referenced, you were talking about creating a sacred space for the stories that we tell.
Yeah.
And the need for reverence. And I'm just, that's something that for me is fundamental in my spiritual practice, is choosing reverence.
Uh-huh.
So I
That's
I
nice.
wanted to hear more about that too.
That's nice. Yeah, they're not unrelated. I'll think about that feminist spirituality class, because I think that was probably the best example of where that happened in my teaching. One is, and I mentioned this before, there's a certain level of appropriate vulnerability and risk-taking that I think a lot about as a professor. And by that I mean, if I'm asking my students to be, say, engaging in a spiritual practice for the semester, which is what I did in this feminist spirituality class, and writing about it, and then reflecting on it together, then I need to be willing to do that to some extent. Not, and I need to be very aware of the power difference and that I'm grading them, but I'm modeling a kind of connection between the ways that I learn and know, and that that understanding something in a spiritual context, that kind of knowing comes through lots of different practices for me, including prayer, including art, actually. And so in the class, we always had some artistic expression or encounter with the material. For example, there's a great book called Handmade Midrash by Joe Milgram. Old book, maybe 1970s something. But she's a Jewish educator, and she always has students explore the biblical text. She introduces the idea of Midrash and the engagement and relationship between someone who's Jewish and the Jewish text. And then she has this like paper tearing exercise that you do with black and white paper when you're looking at a passage in Genesis about creation. And so it's very experiential, and it's one of those things where everybody can tear paper, so nobody's like, I'm not an artist, I can't do it. There is a lot of anxiety if you're going to bend the rules of the academic classroom. You have to be sensitive. Like the people who are there did not sign up for a craft class or an art class. So I'm always very wary that it's not going to introduce this level of judgment and anxiety about the artistic production. But I really want people to have an experience of how different kinds of knowing are available through different kinds of engagements. So this paper tearing exercise is fascinating, and then people put out all their papers, and then there's different levels of sharing, invitation to share. What did you learn about that passage that you hadn't noticed before because you did this paper tearing exercise? So you start building up those muscles a little. In every class, we would have at least one activity that was not like rational, intellectual. But the important connection I want folks to see is not that those are separate, but those are realms that inform each other in profound ways, and that they can be revealing for us personally and us collectively, and that sometimes we're limiting our own learning to this very narrow band of sort of how we learn. And that the goal remains the same. The goal remains sort of an enlightenment in relationship to the material and the subjects that we're grappling with, but that we're opening up the possibility there are other ways to do that. That also goes to your second question a little. When you frame it in this judgment-free way, in this like we're all taking some risks here together way, I have found that creates an incredibly sacred space and feeling. In this same class, for example, I often sing my prayers, in a very spontaneous way when I'm driving. One thing I love about my evangelical background is we can pray like on the, you want me to pray, I will pray for you. There's sort of a lack of self-consciousness about praying to God that I got from that upbringing. And I love that. And for me, it expresses itself sometimes in the sort of spontaneous song. And I share just one little piece of singing of a sung prayer that emerged for me out of a very specific experience that related to the coursework that we were doing. So again, it was a calculated risk, and I'm not a singer, and they didn't sign up to hear me sing, but it allowed for a kind of openness and honesty in the classroom, and it created, over time, you have that capacity to create an atmosphere where trust can build, where a sense of safety builds, and really the relationships that developed in that class among the students was so powerful. There were a couple of women in our class who are actually going through cancer treatments during the semester, and they drove each other to the appointments, and they really supported each other through that. So it became about the whole person in a way that not many of my classes have, because we were saying this is about everything. This is about who you are. This is about your authentic self, what Christianity has to do with that, where you meet God. And I'm kind of a boundary girl. I'm very aware of boundaries and safety. So all of that has to be intact. I've been in some classes where it gets a little off track in ways that are creative but don't feel entirely safe, because maybe the expectations are just sort of out of line with what you're available for or signed up for, and there's not a lot of choice. And they're like, now you go and dance for us. So, I mean, that literally hasn't happened, but versions of that. So I think you have to be really thoughtful and mindful about it, but if you do it with a good intention, I think there's a lot of wiggle room. People are willing to go with you if you explain why.
Our time
Your
is up.
time is
I'm
up.
sorry, I'm gonna need to.
I talked really long, I'm sorry.
I know, it was fabulous. Thank you so much. It was fabulous.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're actually going to stay another 15 minutes, and
Okay.
if the two of you are willing and able to stay for another 15 minutes, we'd love to have you join in.
Sure.
I invite you to shake your heads and your hands because we're moving into a new moment. I got busy with that. Wow. We're moving into a new moment. We're doing some theory. We're going to do 2 steps of analysis, and very simple. One is to identify in very brief sentences or phrases practices that you've heard from Melia and Jenny that they practice in their own interfaith peace building or interfaith education lives. And then I'm going to, this is part of a kind of analytic framing that we've been doing anyway, it's just one piece of it. Then I'm going to invite all of you together, and especially Melia and Jenny, to identify theoretical constructs that are emerging for you about interfaith peace building. Theories that you're coming up with. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
So let's just do the practices for 3 or 4 minutes. Shout them out.
Relationship building.
So yeah, I also the same relationship building and learn from others.
Authenticity. Authenticity.
Regular prayer life.
The importance of education.
Andrea?
Is it the importance of education?
Peace and justice go hand in hand.
Humility.
Risk taking.
Did someone say authenticity just now? Someone just said, okay.
Honoring the differences.
Drawing from the wells of our faith upbringing.
Now let's just begin to build theoretical pieces. We can imagine we're building interfaith peace building, and we're putting some bricks into this building. What are some of the theoretical insights that are emerging for you? And Amelia and Jenny, I hope you'll enter into this. Yes.
Everyone I've heard interviewed, I missed one, has talked very much about grassroots orientation.
Also the importance of kind of like anti-bigotry or anti-oppression kind of key factors in true peace building.
One thing for me that I've already talked about several times that I've heard over and over in different ways is the idea of transformation and how we exert change not through opposition.
And the importance to opening to unexpected moments when transformation or challenge breaks in, like the young man who went to the microphone, for example.
Yeah, I also heard the power of narratives. So people's story transform many things, and then they got same table, the story changed other things.
And that the narratives, you don't know what you're going to learn from them until you spin the story and reflect on them.
Bringing about change through drawing creativity into an already established space.
Lauren.
I'm kind of offering a different response because we're mentioning theory, but I really appreciated, I think Jenny, you said this, the risks of having it to be utilitarian. So especially if you're in a minority and you're called in, so the risk of theorizing peacemaking so that it kind of devolves into utilitarianism. I really appreciate it.
I think it also, sorry.
No, go ahead.
One of the things that all of the peacemakers have really talked about is kind of having an accessible language, and especially with both of you talking about, like, even though coming from higher education, making sure that the work you're doing is accessible.
I was going to say that conditions that cultivate openness and humility are when your identity is not being threatened, or when you don't feel, and the moment when you arrived at Harvard and suddenly your faith was not, that there were others like you, that there may have been room for other things to grow because you didn't feel as though that was a defining identity that you had to defend or be conscious of as much as you had been.
And the power, building on that, the power of placing yourself in new experiences that shake your identity. Going to Harvard, crossing the country, beginning to wear the hijab and so forth. Any others? What about you, Amelia? You've told your story and you've listened to Jenny. What's emerging for you?
I think also that the notion of really honoring one another, right? Like honoring each other as human beings, and not just by lip service, by truly honoring the other. That's so important. I think that it's illustrated, I think, in both of our narratives.
Another thing that struck me in the conversation tonight, or the interview, is instead of having this relates back to talking about intellectual knowledge versus experiential knowledge. Instead of taking a view purely of diagnosis where you're externally focused on what can I do this, or how do I implement such and such, and focusing on the virtue. So like what are the qualities of a leader in their hearts, and living according to those, instead of what does it outwardly look like. And in that way you live true to who you are, and you are also much more effective.
Wow, you guys are great. I'm like jotting notes down like you do. These are excellent. I think the one thing I've learned in this work, and that was reflected in some of the stories I was telling, is just how complex we are as human beings and how identity is not reducible to any one of these categories. And in interfaith peace building, you're often foregrounding religious identity. But one of the most effective strategies sometimes can be to help people step back from that as their only identifier. Maybe we've become so over-identified with one aspect of who we are, we lose sight of, the ways in which we might be more similar, or, as mothers, let's talk about this versus as Jews and Christians where we differ. So I think the complexity of individual identity and then the ways in which those identities bump up against each other is become an important piece of the work.
I think to expand upon that too is, this is interfaith, but then to talk about intrafaith, where you maybe, you're encountering your faith always very differently, and you may yourself be a minority within the faith community. So to establish those relationships in context of the interfaith and the diversity within each faith.
That makes me think of one other thing I often worry about sometimes with peacemaking work is we want to find the bad guy, right? We want to find who's wrong and what's wrong and put it right. And sometimes just that binary polarizing thinking is actually fueling the problem. And your insight made me think of it, because if we can look at the ways in which we're both minority and majority status in certain situations, the places where we're both victim and perpetrator in certain situations, the places where we've helped and where we've hurt. And if we allow for that complexity in ourselves, we can allow for that complexity in others, and that often makes the work a lot less polarizing, us, them. I'm always looking for ways to break that down, and I sometimes worry in the rhetoric of peace and war that we're actually not allowing for the complexity of being both perpetrator and victim, maybe in the same day.
Yeah.
Lisa?
I just like one thing that that each of you said, I feel like I've started to connecting them together, is the idea that Jenny, you said that this work invites you to be your biggest self, and then I think of the idea that the way you should treat someone as if you can see yourself in their on their heart, or I'm searching for the quote somewhere, but I think those, if you think about it, I think they mean the same thing. Like, what is required of you to how you can be your biggest self when you can see yourselves in the hearts of others.
Mila, do you want to build on that one?
Yeah, and I think it also, I really appreciated your question actually in terms of when I said that, and also at the same time, and I think Jenny said the same thing, not negating our differences, right? It's so important because that's who we are. That's being authentic to our own selves. And the moment that we lose that authenticity, it's very difficult to make any impact in the work that you do, in any degree. So I think, certainly it's so important that we see each other as an extension of one another. So you see the image of yourself. I always say this, so that you see the image of yourself in the hearts of the other, right? And recognize that and honor them as such. But at the same time, also recognize that, there's a room of 20-some students. I'm the only one with a scarf on my head. Clearly, we're not all alike, and that's all right. And in fact, that's beautiful. So let's build on that. So that's really equally as important in that regard.
One more?
I got one.
I have one too. Let me go ahead, and then because this, Mila, you said when asked about anger and sadness and frustration, those three words were used. You said that in something to the effect that engaging in the effort keeps you going. I think that you've revealed something about the inner psyche that is given hope by simply engaging in the effort and channeling the anger or sadness or frustration. Can you say just a word more about that?
Yeah, I think the question was that, don't you ever get angry or, so there's so many things that one can face. I mean, I think it's certainly something that develops over experience after experience and experience, but I think in any given situation, you really have to step back and really almost do a cost-benefit analysis of what your reaction will be, right? What is the case at hand? And yes, it's something that should have never happened, but I choose to react to it the way that I choose to react to it. And what will that reaction be? And what, as a community organizer, as a community builder, as a peace builder, and a bridge builder, I have a responsibility and accountability to my own self insofar as what that action will be or reaction, because that's going to make a difference in how I affect the community around me. So I think really, I think we shouldn't disregard those emotions. They're important, but at the same time, I think our faith precepts also mandates us to kind of step back and also realize or recognize how to deal with those emotions as well, and really react in a way that really serves the greater good. But it's not easy, and like I said, I think it's something that develops more and more, for good or worse with all the experiences that you encounter. But I think, once we step back and we do that cost-benefit analysis, then we're more, we find more joy, right? In reacting with it in a way that's more productive than it is more reactionary. And I think we're fortunate to be in a position where, with that example of the whole, someone trying to kill me, I have a position where I can do something about it, and that's a responsibility and an account, that we have. But it takes time, and it's okay to take time. And I think, Jenny, you said that beautifully as well, that, it's not a quick fix, it's definitely the journey. It's definitely the journey, and that's what's important, and to honor that as well.
We have time to hear Bryce's last word.
Oh shoot, man. Oh, shoot. I have it.
Short comment too, if I can.
Okay.
Another theme for me is just, and it goes along with transformation, the willingness to be changed when you're approaching the work. Like, the mutual interaction of that just fascinates me.
Good. The one thing I was just thinking as you were talking that I wanted to get in there was I've started to increasingly think of the goal of interfaith work that I do is to help us commit to safeguarding each other's identities, and this is where the difference comes in. So religious minority groups everywhere are under siege if we look globally, and that's a situation where interreligious peace building is extremely relevant. But if in your heart your deepest desire is for your religious neighbor to freely express the fullness of who she is as a Muslim, who my colleague is as a Jewish person, that's the kind of heart I want to cultivate. And I would hope that they would feel likewise. They would want to safeguard that space for me to be my fullest, authentic Christian self. So,
Thank you. Thank you both. You're just awesome. And thanks to our two interview teams who did an incredible job interviewing today.